The Crimson Royal Guards of Emperor Palpatine are among the most iconic symbols of fear in the entire galaxy and mythos. Silent, faceless, and robed in deep scarlet, they were the shadows of the Emperor's throne. A constant reminder that even approaching them was a death sentence. For generations, they fascinated fans as some of the most mysterious warriors in all of Star Wars lore. But what many don't realize is that before Palpatine ever created his Crimson Guard, his master Darth Plagueis had his own order of elite warriors, the Sun Guard of Thyrsus. The story of the Sun Guards is one of tradition, violence, manipulation, and ultimately extinction. They began not as Sith agents, but as warriors born from the proud martial culture of the Ichani. Over centuries, they forged a reputation rivaling even the great Mandalorians, and by the time of Darth Plagueis and his rise to power, the Sun Guard had become one of the most feared mercenary companies in the entire galaxy. Through a combination of ideology, manipulation, and wealth, Plagueis bent them into his own personal royal guard, the hidden hand that secured Sith power in the shadows of the Republic. Welcome back to the archives, Acolytes of the Force. We've been expecting you. Today we'll be examining Darth Plagueis' own royal guard, the foundation of the royal guards that we know under Darth Sidious. This is the group that carried out a lot of Darth Plagueis' plans during the rise of the Rule of Two in its final years. A group that goes unsung in the annals of Sith history. But today, lore junkies, we'll be exploring the Sun Guard. To understand the Sun Guard, we must first look at their ancestors, the Ichani. The Ichani were renowned for their martial tradition. They were a people who believed that combat was the truest form of expression, a way to communicate through emotions and through movement, a duel and a struggle. Ichani combat relies on finesse, agility, and reading the body language of an enemy. Their society was largely female-dominated, with women holding positions of leadership and command among the Ichani people. But among the Ichani worlds, the 6 sisters of the Ichani command, one stood apart: Thyrsus. Thyrusian culture diverged sharply from its Ichani cousins. Thyrusians were darker-skinned, male-dominated, and far more aggressive as a people. Where the Ichani emphasized graceful dueling and hand-to-hand combat, the Thyrusians embraced heavy armor, bladed weaponry, and open battlefield domination. Where the Ichani revered the moon as a spiritual symbol, the Thyrusians worshipped the sun, a source of blinding power, dominance, destruction, and ultimately rebirth. The cultural divide ultimately became a political one. In the year 1154 BBY, Thyrsus broke from the Ichani command during the Bagali uprising. The Ichani eventually reclaimed some of the breakaway systems, but Thyrsus remained fiercely independent. Their special forces, now hardened soldiers marked by sun sigils and blackened armor. This became the foundation of what would later be known as the Sun Guard. Over the centuries that followed, the Thyrusian Special Forces evolved from a planetary defense unit into a galaxy-spanning mercenary company. They retained the fanatic zeal of their sun-worshipping roots, but increasingly sold their skills to the highest bidder. By the time of the Pact of Almera in 899 BBY, an act that confirmed their independence from the Ichani people, allowing them to begin and make their own rulership and name in conflicts across the entire galaxy. The Thyrusians were now completely independent. Unlike many mercenary bands, the Sun Guard built a reputation for fanatic reliability. If you could afford their high price, they would succeed where others would fail. Sabotage, assassinations, kidnappings, warfare. Their methods were brutal, but their results were undeniable. Over time, their armor became as feared as their name. Gleaming black, with sharp-lined helmets and a crimson insignia, the Sun Guard warriors could strike terror into entire cities just by appearing on a battlefield. The group's religious heritage never disappeared entirely either. Though their mercenary lifestyle often replaced faith with credits, many Sun Guards still believed their service tied them to a greater destiny. The Sun Guard believed in a prophecy that one day, the galaxy would be remade by the coming of a savior known as the Son of Suns. As time went on, the Sun Guard would create many rivalries among the stars, but the greatest rival of all was of course the warrior culture of the Mandalorians. Both cultures valued martial tradition, both operated as mercenaries, and both were feared across the stars. To the Thyrusians, the Mandalorians were their competitors, never their allies. The rivalry was not only cultural though, but it was tactical. The Mandalorians relied heavily on jetpacks and aerial attacks. The Sun Guard, contemptuous of this style, developed specific anti-air pike techniques, designed to disable or to even overload Mandalorian jetpacks mid-flight. Battles between the two groups became legendary, often fought in duels and small-scale skirmishes that could last for years, as Beskar sharpened against Cortosis. The most famous of these rivalries was the Battle of Syntheti. In the year 402 BBY, hired by rival factions vying for control of the Horned Throne, the Sun Guard and the Mandalorians clashed over 3 years, fighting in the catacombs of the world. This was a war of ambushes, duels, and attrition. Neither side could fully dominate the other, and the conflict cemented the Sun Guard's reputation as one of the only groups in the galaxy capable of going toe-to-toe with a Mandalorian force. This rivalry sharpened the Sun Guard into some of the most feared melee fighters in history. Their pikes were honed against Beskar armor. The Sun Guards, in turn, laced their weapons with cortosis ore, a material capable of disrupting lightsabers. In essence, the Sun Guard's wars against the Mandalorians prepared them for their eventual conflicts with the Jedi. But now enters the Sith. The prophecy of the Son of Suns was at the heart of the Thyrisian religion. To the Thyrisians, the sun was the supreme symbol of power, a giver of life, a destroyer of worlds. Prophecy foretold that one day a savior would arise, bathed in the power of the sun to bring about galactic transformation. At first, the prophecy was simply a cultural story, binding the Sun Guard's warrior identity to cosmic meaning. And as the Sith rebuilt themselves in secret under the rule of two, the prophecy became a tool ripe for Sith manipulation. The Sith whispered that they, the Dark Lords, were the true inheritors of the galaxy, that the Son of Suns was not a future savior, but the Sith themselves, destined to blot out the Jedi and to remake the galaxy in fire and in dominance. The Sun Guard, whose very name and symbolism tied directly to the sun, this reinterpretation was a powerful one. When Darth Plagueis emerged as the Dark Lord, he inherited this ideological groundwork. For Plagueis, the prophecy was the perfect tool to bind the Sun Guard not just through credits, but through destiny. Darth Plagueis, though, was not an emperor. He could not openly field armies or clones, nor could he rely on vast political machinery to protect him. What he needed was discretion. He also required elite warriors who would serve as his bodyguards, assassins, and enforcers without drawing any Jedi suspicion. The Sun Guard were perfect for him. Through his public persona as Hiko Damask of Damask Holdings, Plagueis funded and supported the Sun Guard openly. He provided them with training grounds such as the planet of Hypori, and employed them at his retreats of Sojourn and Moonalis respectively. They became his personal guard, replacing other mercenary groups such as the Iotran Brandsmen. The Sun Guards carried out his will with ruthless efficiency. They assassinated business rivals, intimidated senators, and even covered up the young Palpatine's massacre of his own family, ensuring no trace led back to Plagueis or the Sith. They stood watch at Plagueis' gatherings of financiers and allies, intimidating anyone who would oppose him. In their armor, they looked like mercenaries, and mercenaries could be explained away. But in truth, they were Plagueis' own royal guard. Sith zealots who believed that they were serving galactic destiny. Unlike Palpatine's later Royal Guard, the Sun Guard were not faceless drones though. Many still thought of themselves as mercenaries, and the lure of wealth never disappeared entirely among their ranks. But Sith manipulation of prophecy gave them a higher cause beyond money. To them, Plagueis was more than an employer. He was the vessel of destiny, the living embodiments of the sun's destruction and its creative abilities. The sun could obliterate life with its fire, but it also gave life to new worlds. In Plagueis, they saw both forces united, a Sith who could destroy the Jedi and create a new galaxy. This dual loyalty, to prophecy and to prophet, made them uniquely effective. They were mercenaries on the outside, Sith cultists on the inside. For Darth Plagueis, this balance was ideal. They were feared, discreet, and above all, extremely useful. But what of their weaponry? The Sun Guard's arsenal reflected their brutal philosophy. Their armor was often black or gold, and it was heavy but mobile, designed directly for intimidation as much as it was defense. It included hidden vibroblades and gauntlets, dart launchers, flamethrowers, heated plates capable of searing flesh. Their helmets provided infrared, ultraviolet, and thermal vision, with built-in scopes for surveillance or sniping. Their signature weapon, however, was the pike, usually about a meter in length, wielded two-handedly, and bladed at both ends. Pikes often incorporated cortosis ore, capable of shorting out lightsabers upon contact. Others were solar pikes. These were ritual weapons that could be superheated on the tip, creating burning temperatures that would sear away flesh like it was nothing. In battles against Jedi and Mandalorians, the pike was devastating. The Sun Guard also trained heavily in urban warfare, sweeping blocks and clearing strongholds. They were as effective in the gladiatorial arena as they were in city sieges. Their ability to read body language, inherited from their Echani roots, allowed them to anticipate any opponent's move, making them almost impossible to outfight in hand-to-hand combat. But what about their legacy? What became of the Sun Guard after Plagueis' death? When Darth Plagueis died at the hands of his apprentice Sidious, he would inherit the Sun Guard by right. At first, Sidious used them well, guarding his strongholds, eliminating rivals, and even sparring partners for Darth Maul. Some Sun Guards were considered as potential clone templates even by the Kaminoans for the clone army. But Palpatine was not content with mercenaries. Where Darth Plagueis relied on prophecy and money, Sidious wanted absolute, faceless loyalty. He orchestrated the purge of the Sun Guard through Dooku and Ventress, ensuring no rival cult would remain. It is rumored though that some survivors were absorbed into a new group, the Red Royal Guard, and later, maybe even the Force-sensitive Shadow Guard, but this is just rumor. By any official records, they were wiped out completely by the Sith. Darth Sidious, who discarded a useful tool, but believed he required a greater one more suited to him. All of the Red Royal Guard of Palpatine drew heavily from the Sun Guard's legacy, but where the Sun Guard believed that they served destiny, Palpatine's guards worshipped him personally. Palpatine was no longer the heir to a prophecy, he was the prophecy fulfilled. The Sun Guard were the hidden precursors to Palpatine's Red Royal Guard, warriors born of Echani tradition, sharpened against Mandalorians, and twisted by Sith prophecy into fanatical servants of Darth Plagueis. They were mercenaries on the surface, zealots beneath, a perfect disguise of Sith power operating in the shadows of the Republic. As for which order of protectors is superior, this is a highly charged and debated topic. The Sun Guard were notorious for their individuality as warriors. Unlike Palpatine's Red Royal Guard, who trained to move and strike as a single unit, the Sun Guard approached combat as independent fighters. This made them extremely dangerous in one-on-one duels, perhaps even superior to the Emperor's Guard in single combat. Where the Red Guards relied on discipline and cohesion, the Sun Guard thrived on personal skill, adaptability, and the ruthless drive to survive. What gave the Sun Guard their edge was their experience across the stars. They weren't sheltered bodyguards drilled only to protect the throne room. They were mercenaries, veterans of hand-to-hand battles against countless species. That kind of hard-earned combat exposure gave them a ferocity and an unpredictability that the more rigid Red Guard may have lacked. Still, when it came to coordinated group tactics, Palpatine's Royal Guard would likely have this advantage. Trained to act as extensions of one another, their unity made them more dangerous as a team, able to overwhelm foes through precision and perfect timing. By contrast, the Sun Guard might clash with each other's styles in a tightly packed fight. But one thing is clear, the Sun Guard were the hidden precursors to Palpatine's Royal Guard, warriors born of Echani tradition, sharpened against Mandalorians, and twisted by prophecy into fanatical servants of Darth Plagueis. They were mercenaries on the surface, zealots beneath, a perfect disguise for Sith power operating in the shadow of the Republic. They assassinated rivals, covered up secrets, and enforced the will of Plagueis, playing a pivotal role in the Sith's final march to dominance. Yet, as with all tools of the Sith, they were discarded when no longer useful. Palpatine replaced them with faceless Crimson Guards whose loyalty was absolute. But behind the red visors of the Emperor's Royal Guard lies the forgotten shadow of the Sun Guard, Darth Plagueis' Royal Guard, and one of the most feared warrior orders in galactic history. There are few sights in Star Wars lore as unsettling as the Emperor's Royal Guard. Crimson robes, faceless visors, silent devotion. They were not stormtroopers nor officers. They were extensions of Palpatine's will, guardians who stood at his side in complete silence. But within their ranks there existed something even darker, a different version, the Shadow Guard. Clad not in red but in black, wielding not ceremonial pikes but lightsaber-bladed weapons of war. They did not speak, they did not question. They existed only as the Emperor's mute Force-sensitive enforcers. Rumors surrounded them even within the Empire. Some believed that they were former Jedi Knights, captured, tortured, and broken until their voices failed. Others thought of them as elite assassins, enhanced through alchemy. But the truth is even more disturbing. The Shadow Guard were the Emperor's attempt to go further than the Royal Guard, to build a core of living shadows whose minds had been erased and tied only to his own. A project inspired by the methods of Darth Vitiate himself. This is the story of the Emperor's Shadow Guard, silent, terrifying, and perhaps the last true secret that even Darth Vader was never meant to fully uncover. Today we will be analyzing the most secretive and precious darkside organization within the entire Empire, at least to Darth Sidious, the only group that he didn't actively share information about to Darth Vader, including their identity, their training, and most important, their purpose. So greetings lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. Today, we'll be looking at the Shadow Guard. To understand the Shadow Guard, we first need to understand the crucible of the Imperial Royal Guard. Recruits chosen from across the Empire, often stormtroopers, commandos, or soldiers already proven in loyalty and battle. They would be sent to the world of Yinchor, a desert planet that served as a training ground. The program was a simple one, but brutal. Hundreds entered, and only a handful ever survived the process. Trainees fought one another in lethal contests, encouraged to kill comrades to prove absolute devotion to their emperor. By the end, those that remained were transformed into silent guardians clad in crimson, whose mere presence radiated only fear. Their weapons, typically force pikes, were ceremonial but deadly. The Emperor's Red Guard were already an elite order on their own, feared across the stars. But there were always anomalies. Amid the survivors, some displayed feats that could not be explained by sheer conditioning or skill. Reflexes faster than any soldier, perception sharper than any human sense, impossible survivals. These few were quietly separated. They were screened for force sensitivity, and when it was confirmed, their fate diverged from others. They were not to be mere guards, they were to become something else entirely. This was the seed of the Shadow Guard, elite soldiers forged through the crucible of Yinchor, then reshaped into darkside adepts. What made the Shadow Guard so different was not just their skill, but it was their silence. Although there was a lot of conditioning and programming, many Red Royal Guards still maintained some individuality under their masks of discipline. The Shadow Guard, however, were stripped of identity entirely, stripped of their voice. In fact, they were famous for never speaking. The reason for this is to them there was nothing left to speak from. All of their personalities, their ambitions, and even their sense of self-preservation was erased. This was not loyalty in a normal sense, it was possession. Their minds were wiped, and they became vessels for the will of their master. The Emperor dominated their will in a way that mirrored the Imperial Guard of Darth Vitiate. Centuries earlier, Vitiate had built his own corps of guardians whose very minds were bound to him, their individuality hollowed out until they existed only as vessels of his will and his power. His guards were so devoted to Vitiate that they would even stand against other Sith Lords, in some cases, even members of the Dark Council. Palpatine adapted this model. The Shadow Guard were not trained to serve, they were made to be a part of him. Their silence reflected this erasure. They did not need words because the Emperor was their voice. This made the Shadow Guard fundamentally different from the Inquisitors. Inquisitors were fallen Jedi, forced to serve through pain or fear, and always at risk of betrayal. The Shadow Guard, literally though, could no longer betray. They could no longer hesitate. They could not defect. There has never been a record of one abandoning Palpatine's command ever, not once. In this way, they were not soldiers, but proof of Sidious's obsession. The absolute control meant not just obedience, but the annihilation of self. The foundation of the Shadow Guard was the same martial excellence as the Red Guard: unarmed combat, bladed weapons, squad leadership tactics. But layered onto this foundation was something the Crimson Guards would never receive: formal training in the dark side of the Force. The Shadow Guard learned abilities that most Imperials thought impossible outside of Sith, even among the Inquisitors. They could unleash Force lightning, but the ability to channel pure rage and pure hatred. To wield it, they had to embrace anger. To survive it, they had to endure it. Many were likely forced to withstand lightning as a part of this conditioning. Some speculate the Inquisitors were used to train the Shadow Guard, striking them with lightning as tests of survival, while others suggest that Sidious himself instructed them in secret, behind closed doors, away from Vader's gaze. In addition, they learned Force Choke, Pulse, Repulse, and even Maelstrom. Unlike the Inquisitors who specialized in lightsaber combat, the Shadow Guard emphasized shock powers, overwhelming force abilities used in tandem with their martial prowess. Their signature weapon was the lightsaber pike, a hybrid of the traditional Guard's force pike and a Jedi weapon. The red blade extended from the tip. It granted reach and leverage in duels. Against Jedi, it was unorthodox and a challenge. This was all by design. Palpatine thrived on the unconventional. just as he had used Grievous to overwhelm Jedi with alien forms and flurries of blades, and just as the Inquisitors were trained to fight in spinning, unpredictable styles, the lightsaber pike was yet another shock weapon. It forced Jedi to fight in ways that they had not trained for, breaking their rhythm and exploiting hesitation. But unlike Grievous or the Inquisitors, the Shadow Guard wielded these weapons with no concern for their own survival. They did not care if their parries shattered their arms, or if their charges left them open to a death blow. Their goal was not victory, it was only ever obedience. The existence of the Shadow Guard was not hidden among the Empire, but its nature was, even from Darth Vader. The secrecy is telling. Vader oversaw the Inquisitors, breaking and training them himself. Their successes and their failures were his responsibility. But the Shadow Guard were deliberately kept outside of his sphere. Their training was compartmentalized. Their orders came directly from Sidious, and even their origins were obscured. But why? It's because the Shadow Guards were not guards at all. They were the failsafe. Palpatine expected betrayal from Darth Vader. It is the way of the Sith. But if Vader turned against him ever, the Inquisitors could not be trusted to stop him alone. Vader had trained them, he knew their every weakness. The Shadow Guard, however, they were loyal only to Sidious. Their minds bowed before his. Their silence was proof of this. Their identity was no longer just erased to the level of a Red Royal Guard through propaganda and drills. The Shadow Guard seemed to be an experiment where Sidious had literally deleted everything but his own will within these avatars. They were more than soldiers. They did not fear, and they would fight to the death. They were the Emperor's insurance policy against Darth Vader. Warriors that would fall by his blade by the dozens, and a dozen more would rally to attack yet again. They guarded the Emperor's most sensitive strongholds when not with him, installations and secrets. When the Inquisitors hunted Jedi, the Shadow Guard were sent to destroy secrets deemed too dangerous for even Vader to possess. They were created to silence rivals. They led squads of stormtroopers and naval commandos, serving as the nucleus of strike teams. Their presence alone elevated missions into something far more than routine. Their most famous encounters were with Galen Merrick's Starkiller. The Shadow Guards fought him across Nar Shaddaa, Cloud City, Kashyyyk, Raxus Prime, and even the first Death Star. They fought and they died to him without hesitation. They were not expected to succeed. Starkiller overwhelmed them, but this only underlines their role. The Shadow Guard were the Emperor's black blades, sent into impossible battles because no one else could be trusted. No one else would so willingly die. The Shadow Guards reveal something clear. They were the governing force of the dark side in this era. Palpatine placed them not only against Jedi, but against his rivals. They served as enforcers, silencers, and watchdogs. In them, the Emperor had a final line of defense against betrayal, from the Inquisitors, from other Sith, and most important, from Darth Vader. Think of them as silent governors and watchers, not governors of worlds, but the governors of the dark side. They enforced the Emperor's supremacy not through politics or fear of bureaucracy, but through raw, unquestioning, silent power. They are also the rarest version of the Emperor's Royal Guard. Sidious knew that even entire squads of his Red Royal Guard could not withstand his apprentice. He knew the Inquisitors would crumble in fear before him. But the Shadow Guard, they were different. They combined the Guard's discipline with the Inquisitor's power, but without the weaknesses of either. They would keep advancing even as Vader cut them down, because their minds were no longer their own. They would die without fear, without hesitation, and without pause. They were, in essence, Palpatine's way of saying, if my apprentice turns, I have warriors who will throw themselves at him until nothing remains. The Inquisitorius collapsed before the rise of the rebellion. Many fell, betrayed, or were destroyed, but the Shadow Guard endured longer. They survived in the era of the Death Star and beyond, still whispering through the Empire as the Emperor's most loyal protectors. They may have even been the foundation of Palpatine's future vision, a core of Force-sensitive guardians who could replace even the Crimson Royal Guard. Like Vitiate before him, Sidious dreamed of a guard so loyal, so erased of self, that they could outlast apprentices and even entire empires. Had Sidious's reign continued, it is possible the Shadow Guard would have become the ultimate enforcers of his will, an order of silent Force warriors ruling the galaxy as the Emperor's eternal shadow. The Shadow Guard were never numerous, they were never celebrated, They existed in the margins, whispered of, but rarely seen. Yet in their silence lies the truth of Palpatine's philosophy. They were no longer men. They were not Jedi or Sith. They were shadows, minds erased, voices silenced, wills bound. They serve as a terrifying reminder that in Sidious's empire, even loyalty could be weaponized until nothing human remained. And perhaps most haunting of all is the thought of what they could have become. Had the Emperor lived, had his order endured, the Shadow Guard would have evolved into something far more dangerous than the Inquisitors, a corps of governors of the dark side, an eternal guard who would never betray, never falter, and never stop. What could be more precious to Emperor Palpatine than his very life? That was the question that echoed in the minds of every Crimson Royal Guard. To stand at the Emperor's side was already the greatest honor a soldier of the Empire could ever hope to achieve. Yet there existed an even higher station, a place beyond the throne room. Some whispered that Palpatine entrusted to these few a secret greater than his own protection, the key to the Empire itself, and the source of his unending power and influence. The secret was revealed only to the rarest of the rare, the chosen few who were elevated above their brothers, handpicked by the Emperor himself to become his champions. To join the Sovereign Protectors, for a royal guard there was no higher honor. To be raised to sovereign was to be entrusted with what the Emperor valued more than his own life. There were few titles in the Empire that carried so much hidden weight as the Sovereign Protector. The word sovereign means supreme authority, the embodiment of absolute rule, and to bear that name meant more than being a guard in crimson robes. These were Palpatine's champions, the highest order of his guard, the men he personally selected from among his most elite. Unlike the normal red-robed guard, where candidates were broken down on Yin Chor until only the last survivor stood, becoming a Sovereign Protector demanded more. Survival alone was not enough. Palpatine had to see you, measure your brilliance, and handpick you himself. Every Sovereign Protector was chosen by the Emperor's eye, elevated not only for their skill, but because he judged them worthy of guarding his sovereignty. They were not simply soldiers, they were Royal Guard champions, the apex of Palpatine's hierarchy of loyalty and protection. At a glance, they resembled the Emperor's Royal Guard, silent figures in red robes and helmets, but sovereigns were set apart. Their armor bore black chest plates and gauntlets. Their helmets had a black vertical panel across the face, black capes draped over their crimson robes. Some wore ornate ceremonial armor, hoods pulled over, and carried scythe-like force pikes. The symbolism here is deliberate. Red tied them to Palpatine's throne. Black marked them as something higher, as guardians of his sovereignty itself. Chosen from the Guard, the Sovereigns underwent years of additional testing and training. Their standards were merciless: combat ability, stamina, reflexes, intelligence, and above all, loyalty. They trained in heavy blaster pistols, vibroblades, and force pikes. They flew exclusive Guard TIE interceptors. They endured psychological conditioning meant to destroy hesitation and to forge absolute devotion. They were organized under champions, leaders selected directly and only by Palpatine. There was only one man in the entire galaxy capable of raising someone to become a Sovereign Protector, and that was the Emperor himself. But the essential truth still remained. They were not simply the survivors of training, they were handpicked. Palpatine himself had to raise them above the rest, and while not all of them were force sensitive, the case of Karnor Jax makes it clear that the Emperor deliberately selected those who showed potential, folding them into his vast network of dark side adepts. But to understand the Sovereigns, we must first compare them to another of the Emperor's creations, the Shadow Guard. Both wore black, both carried pikes, both sometimes displayed abilities and aptitude in the Force, but their natures were entirely different. The Shadow Guard were assassins. They were voiceless instruments of Palpatine's will. Their entire identities had been erased. They did not speak. They existed only as extensions of the Emperor's command, hunting Darksiders who had strayed, Jedi who had survived, or enemies too dangerous for conventional troopers. They were disposable knives, terrifying, but faceless. The Sovereign Protectors, by contrast, retained their identities, their brilliance, their cunning, their personality. It was all preserved and even sharpened. Palpatine trusted them not as shadows but as individuals, those who were refined into champions. And in Karnor Jax we see what a champion meant, a Sovereign Protector who retained not only his identity, but also his ambition. But what exactly did they guard? What was the greatest mystery of the Empire that not even the Royal Guards were privy to? Most imagined Palpatine's throne to be on Coruscant, but that was just theater. His true throne lay in the hidden deep core on a world called Biss. Biss had been reshaped by the dark side. Millions were lured there with promises of a paradise, only to be drained of their life to fuel the Emperor and his plans, and at its heart stood the Citadel. The Citadel was the true seat of sovereignty. Here were the clone labs, where new bodies awaited Sidious. Here were vaults filled with Jedi relics, Sith manuscripts. Here Palpatine composed the Darkside Compendium, works like the Book of Anger and the Creation of Monsters. The Citadel also held museums, great halls for Palpatine's inner circle, sanctums where Sith holocrons like the Tedran holocron and others were studied. It was here where the Sovereign Protectors stood guard. They patrolled the clone labs, the libraries, the halls of power. They defended monasteries, palaces, and data centers from across the galaxy, all tied to Palpatine's immortality. They watched over the Eclipse Dreadnought, the mobile fortress that carried Palpatine's arsenal and his mobile throne. Their duty was not to protect his body. Their duty was to protect the Emperor's eternity. This is why sometimes Palpatine dismissed his guards. He needed no protection from assassins. His mastery of the Force made him invulnerable. The Crimson Guard at his side were mostly for display. The Sovereign Protectors were elsewhere, unseen, protecting what truly mattered. Their invisibility was not weakness, it was the essence of their role. And among them, one name pierces history: Karnor Jax. In 11 ABY, Jax was elevated to a Sovereign Protector, aided by Sarkev's quest of the Imperial Ruling Council. But Karnor was more than a champion. He secretly apprenticed under Lumaya, Dark Lady of the Sith, herself molded after Vader and Sidious. Here lies the ultimate irony. Palpatine perfected the art of training Darkside adepts under his empire. Inquisitors, Shadow Guards, other apprentices, even Darth Vader. But from within that system came betrayal. Karnor Jax embraced the Sith lesson that the apprentice must destroy the master. Karnor bribed the Emperor's physician. He had the clone bodies sabotaged. Every time Sidious tried to transfer his essence, the bodies decayed rapidly. His immortality was undone by a man sworn to guard it. The betrayal echoed the rule of two: sabotage, subterfuge, the apprentice overthrowing the master. And though Jax's force potential was minor compared to true Sith Lords, weaker even than Lumaya, his brilliance and conditioning as a guard made him devastating, even against his master. Karnor Jax became one of the most overlooked yet cunning figures in all of Star Wars EU. He proved that possessing the Force alone does not decide one's destiny. A Sovereign Protector, handpicked by Sidious, used Sith methods to wound him in ways no Jedi ever would. When we compare the standard Royal Guard to a Sovereign Protector, the difference is immediately clear. The regular Guard were loyal, disciplined, deadly, but their role was ultimately ceremonial and defensive. They were trained to obey, to intimidate, and to strike if commanded. But the Sovereign Protectors were greater. They were not just guards, they were champions, the most refined and dangerous expression of the Guard tradition. He picked them not only for their martial skill, but for their intelligence, their cunning, and for their potential. Karnor Jax proves this better than anyone. No ordinary guard could have bribed the Emperor's personal physician, sabotaged Palpatine's cloned bodies, and struck at the very foundation of his immortality. That act alone shows a level of access, brilliance, and daring that is utterly beyond the Crimson Guard. Where a standard guardsman was trained to die for the Emperor, a Sovereign Protector like Jax had the ability to kill him and nearly remake the Empire in his own image. The massacre at Yinchor underscores this point further. Jax not only ordered the annihilation of the Guard's training complex, but actually survived the political fallout to position himself as the heir to the Empire. He declared himself the Emperor's successor, and in doing so demonstrated the ultimate truth. The Sovereigns were not simply the Emperor's shadows, they were his successors in waiting. At least one of them tried to be. The Royal Guard represented loyalty, the Sovereign Protectors represented power. They were the most powerful variant of the Guard ever created, and Karnor Jax embodied both their greatness and their fatal flaw. Karnor Jax embodied both the success and the failure of the Sovereign Protectors. They were too brilliant to erase, but in choosing one with ambition, Palpatine sealed his fate. Being trained by Lumaya tied him directly to Sidious's legacy. He betrayed him from within. Karnor Jax was the apex of the Guard, and its greatest traitor. The Sovereign Protectors were never ceremonial. They were not voiceless assassins like the Shadow Guard. They were Palpatine's champions. They guarded his bodies, his manuscripts, his holocrons, and even his throne world. They were sovereignty made flesh. And yet it was one of them, Carnor Jax, who betrayed him. His ambition, though fueled by limited force potential, was enough to wound the greatest Sith Lord of the age. His story proves the oldest truth of the dark side: the greater danger always comes from within. But Carnor Jax's tale does not end here, for Kyrkanos, the last true royal guard, swore vengeance and carried the guard's legacy into the Crimson Empire. There are few figures in Star Wars as haunting as the Emperor's personal guard: the crimson-clad Royal Guard, the silent Sovereign Protectors, and the black-armored Shadow Guard. Each of them was terrifying in their own right, symbols of Palpatine's power and his obsession with loyalty. But standing apart from all of them is something stranger, something more grotesque: the Imperial Sentinels. These were not men chosen for loyalty. They were not elite soldiers elevated through training. They were not ambitious Force adepts clawing their way to power. The Sentinels were engineered from the ground up, cloned in secret facilities, mutated by alchemy, and stripped of will before they could even form unique identities. They were never meant to be individuals. They were never meant to be human. They were half-finished experiments, a halfway perfected attempt from Palpatine to forge a race of living statues who would embody his will. And where they stood tells us everything. Greetings again, Acolytes and Lore Junkies, and welcome back to the channel and the archives. Today, we will be finishing our look at the Imperial Royal Guards, with the most terrifying group of them all, the Imperial Sentinels from the world of Biss. The Sentinels were not stationed on Coruscant, where the Emperor paraded his Crimson Guards before the Senate and the galaxy at large. They were stationed on Biss, Palpatine's true throne world. The world where his clone bodies were grown, where the dark side compendium was written, where his most prized secrets and treasures were stored. Biss was not the public face of the Empire, but it was the hidden heart of it. And there, at the core of Sidious's power, the Sentinels stood as his watchers. This is the story of the Imperial Sentinels, half-complete monsters, grotesque guardians, and perhaps the most unsettling creations of Darth Sidious's reign. Part 1. Their origins in alchemy and in science. The origins of the Imperial Sentinels are unlike any other guard class in Palpatine's service. The Royal Guard were elite stormtroopers and soldiers, conditioned to absolute loyalty. The Sovereign Protectors were chosen for their skill, and sometimes even their potential in the Force. Even the Shadow Guards, black-clad assassins with lightsaber pikes, were born men, trained, indoctrinated, and erased until their voices were gone. But the Sentinels are different. They were not born. They were grown. Deep within the secret cloning facility of the world of Biss, tissue stock was used to begin their growth. During their gestation, chemicals were introduced that suppressed higher brain functions, speech, independence, imagination, even the ability to resist orders. These chemicals created blank slates, beings who could move, fight, and obey, but who would never think for themselves. And on top of this, dark-side adepts performed alchemy, mutating and growing clones into hulking giants. This alone sets the Sentinels apart from the other classes of the guards. Sith alchemy was an art of the ancient Sith, used to twist flesh, forge monsters, and to bind the dark side into unnatural vessels. In the era of the Rule of Two, it was almost unheard of. Darth Bane had dismissed it largely. Sidious himself usually relied on politics, apprentices, and his mastery in other methods of the Force. But the Sentinels were proof that he indulged in alchemy directly, and the results are disturbing ones. His cultists attempted to create mental bonds with their Sentinels, tying them to their will. If the process succeeded, the Sentinels became a living puppet, utterly reliant on its master for purpose and direction. If it failed, the creature was destroyed instantly. Rumors circulated even among the adepts that the first generation of Sentinels had been cloned from Force-sensitive stock. The early versions were immensely powerful, but unstable to the point of madness. Their sensitivity to the dark side clashed with their chemical suppression, creating insane hulks that could not be controlled. Later generations were deliberately dulled, stripped of whatever Force potentials their predecessors had possessed. This made them far weaker, but manageable. In this sense, the Sentinels were always incomplete. They were halfway successes, terrifying in presence, but flawed in design, never perfected. They were a glimpse at what Palpatine wanted, an army of alchemical soldiers bred for loyalty. But what they also were was a reminder of his limits. Now we reach part 2, their history. The Sentinels' history spans the final days of the Republic through the last moments of Palpatine's reborn Dark Empire, but their appearances are always rare, always shrouded in secrecy and importance. Their first appearance was as early as 19 BBY in the Purge of Ashkaboda. Their first known deployment came at the dawn of the Empire, during the Great Jedi Purge. On an unnamed planet, several Jedi had been captured. Among them was the Jedi Master Ashkaboda, a member of the Librarians' Assembly. The Sentinels appeared at the battlefield carrying authentic Imperial data chips. They took custody of Boda, loaded him onto their dungeon ship, and brought him to Coruscant. There, Palpatine had Boda tortured and then executed. But what mattered most was what Boda carried, the Tedran holocron. This holocron contained the wisdom of the ancients, Jedi Masters, and Palpatine used it to compose the Book of Anger, the first volume of his Darkside Compendium. In this way, the Imperial Sentinels are directly tied to one of the most infamous works of Sith philosophy in galactic history. Then we reach the early Imperial era, the Sarlacc Project. First-generation Sentinels were also stationed aboard the Golan defense platform guarding a Super Star Destroyer prototype above the world of Biss. They were stationed at the so-called Sarlacc Project. Alderaanian resistance agents who infiltrated the station confronted the Sentinels in Docking Bay 616, learning firsthand what these giants were capable of. And then we reach 2 BBY, their early sightings. As of 2 BBY, the Sentinels are still rarely seen outside of Biss. But occasionally, they did make public appearances, usually transporting Force users in custody. These brief sightings created wild rumors within the Imperial courts. Some whispered that the Sentinels were cyborgs or droids. Others claimed that they were remnants of a giant species enslaved by Palpatine. Some even speculated that they were rebels who had dared to defy the Emperor, transformed into hulks as punishment for their crime. And then comes the Galactic Civil War. Rumors and whispers within the rebellion. Rumors of the Sentinels spread like ghost stories. Giant armored warriors who stood at the Emperor's side, his most terrifying enforcers. But few had ever seen them, and fewer still had survived. 10 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Dark Empire. It was not until Palpatine's rebirth on Biss that the Sentinels were unleashed more openly. During Operation Shadowhand, they were seen guarding the Emperor's citadel, patrolling cloning facilities, and working alongside Imperial Dungeoneers on dungeon ships. It was during this time that Luke Skywalker, after defecting to Palpatine, would even breed 2 Sentinels of his own. These hulks would escort Han Solo, Leia Organa, and C-3PO to Palpatine's personal clone labs, where they attempted to rescue Luke. When one of the Sentinels restrained Han, Leia ignited her lightsaber and severed the creature's hand. It did not scream. It simply obeyed until it was destroyed. 11 years after the Battle of Yavin and the fall of Biss, the Sentinel's fate was tied to Biss itself. When R2-D2 sabotaged the hyperdrive of the Eclipse II, sending it crashing into the Galaxy Gun, the resulting misfire destroyed the world of Biss. With it went Palpatine's cloning facilities, his hidden empire, and the Sentinels. Most of them were obliterated, erased with the world that they had been built to protect and serve. But what of their powers and abilities? The terror of the Sentinels was not only their story, it is what they were. They were gargantuan, twice the height and strength of any ordinary man, towering even above the Emperor's Crimson Elite Guards. Their sheer size made them capable of overpowering almost any opponent through brute force alone. Their primary weapons were massive vibro axes, sized to match their bulk. They also carried blasters when needed. Despite their size though, they were trained in unarmed martial arts and even beast riding, further proof that they were meant to function as more than just statues. They wore heavy battle armor beneath long reddish-purple cloaks emblazoned with golden designs. Their helmets concealed their faces entirely, revealing only glowing red eyes. No flesh was ever visible. This gave them the appearance of living statues, faceless, unyielding. What made them most unnatural, though, was their alchemical alterations. Through Sith sorcery, their bodies were warped, their minds were blanked. Rumors held that adepts could even see through their eyes, making them literal extensions of their masters. But here lies the greatest uncertainty. Were they Force users? The truth is complicated. The earliest generations of the Sentinels may very well have been. Their raw connection to the dark side made them dangerously unstable, but later versions were deliberately dulled. They had no conscious mastery of the Force. Instead, they existed as Force perversions, bodies twisted by alchemy, saturated in corruption, radiating the dark side but not wielding it per se. In a sense, they were terrifying not because of what they could do, but because of what they represented. They were empty vessels touched by the Force, proof of Palpatine's desire to create life not for the sake of life, but for the sake of obedience and the glorification of self. To be a Sith was to subscribe to the worship of self. The Sentinels were not for display though. They were not for ceremony. They were stationed exclusively on Biss, where Palpatine was at his most vulnerable. They stood guard over the Citadel, his cloning facilities, his personal labs. Some even protected restricted areas of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant. But they also functioned as escorts for Palpatine's adepts. Whenever one of his inner circle was dispatched on a high-priority mission, Sentinels would accompany them off-world. Their presence was both protective and symbolic, a sign that the adepts spoke with the Emperor's authority. But above all, they were symbols of fear. Their sheer size, their silence, their facelessness, all of it made them more terrifying than stormtroopers, more unnerving than inquisitors. They were the mute hulks of Biss, rarely seen, never explained, and always lethal. So with all of that said, how did the Imperial Sentinels really stack up against Palpatine's other guards? This is one of our favorite thought exercises when we look at all of the guards. To answer that, we need to place them in the larger lineage of elite warriors who served the Emperor. From the mercenary Sun Guard, to the Crimson Royal Guard, to the black-clad Shadow Guard, all the way to the Sovereign Protectors. Each rung of the pyramid represented a refinement of loyalty, power, and skill. At the base, the Sun Guards of Thyresis, mercenaries whose discipline and martial prowess first inspired Palpatine's model for the elite guards. The Sun Guards who had fanatically followed his own master Darth Plagueis. Above them, the Imperial Royal Guard, handpicked from the Emperor's best soldiers, trained on Yin Chor, and molded into silent Crimson Sentinels of loyalty. Then came the Shadow Guards, Royal Guards with Force sensitivity, their identities broken away and their voices erased, armed with lightsaber pikes to hunt Jedi and to silence darkside rivals. At its peak, the Sovereign Protectors, Palpatine's most elite guardians, stationed on Biss itself. Not all wielders of the Force, but some like Karnor Jax, powerful enough to receive formal training from the Sith. And then you have the Imperial Sentinels. They do not sit neatly inside of this pyramid. They weren't men elevated to higher service. They were grown as grotesque creations, engineered husks clad in ceremonial armor, lacking the finesse of the Sovereigns, the speed of the Shadows, and even the tactical minds of the Crimson Guards. What they possessed was something entirely different. A terrifying absence of will. But what makes them terrifying is not what they were, but what they may have become. In their final form, the Sovereign Protectors clearly stood above all of them in skill and refinement. But the Sentinels were the only guard Force engineered from conception. Born not as men, but as husks sculpted by alchemy. If Palpatine had perfected this process, stabilizing Force sensitivity, fusing their immense physical strength with true mastery of the dark side, the Sentinels could have eclipsed every other guard by a huge margin. Imagine an entire corps of towering giants, loyal from birth, wielding the Force with the same tireless obedience that they already embodied. No ambition, no betrayal, no hesitation. Only the Emperor's will given flesh. It never came to pass. They remained incomplete, destroyed on Biss. But in their shadow lingers the nightmare of their potential. A glimpse at what Palpatine truly desired. An army not of men, but of monsters. Monsters who would have stood as the ultimate guardians of the eternal empire. What I find most interesting about the Imperial Sentinels is how they weren't just a late Dark Empire creation. At least some of them were already around in the early days of the Empire, tied directly to Ashka Boda and the Tedran Holocron. That means Palpatine was experimenting with these alchemical giants almost from the very beginning, likely even when he was the Supreme Chancellor, the humble Palpatine. They serve as a reminder of how fascinating the lore in the world of Biss is also. Palpatine's true throne, steeped in secrets, clone vats, and darkside corruption. Biss is unique in Star Wars because it's not just another fortress world. It was the Emperor's hidden heart. I like the idea of the Sentinels being the final stop of the Guardsman ladder, the grotesque endpoint of the Sun Guards, the Royal Guards, the Shadow Guards, and the Sovereign Protectors. But the truth is that they failed. They were incomplete experiments, and the Sovereign Protectors remained the clear number one in Palpatine's hierarchy. If the two ever matched against each other, I think the outcome is clear. A Sentinel's sheer size and strength might overwhelm an opponent at first, but the Sovereign Protector's refined skill, and in the case of Karnor Jax, the use of the dark side, would cut them down. The Sentinels were terrifying in presence, but the Sovereigns were perfected. In the end, the Sentinels stand as one of the strangest footnotes of Palpatine's empire, half-finished monsters whose legacy lies not in what they achieved, but in the haunting glimpse of what they could have become. What was it about the Emperor's royal guards that made Darth Vader absolutely despise them? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. The Emperor's Red Guard find themselves in a very unique position. As the personal protectors of Darth Sidious himself, they have his very life resting in their hands. And not only that, but they are privy to the fact that their master and Vader are far more than meets the eye. The guards are fully aware of the role of the Sith, but their blind loyalty and devotion to Palpatine helps them keep this a secret. Yet despite their usefulness and loyalty to the Sith cause, Darth Vader just couldn't stand being around them. It is extremely easy to infer based on their interactions and the reaction that Vader himself gives in certain situations containing the royal guards. And to that end, we'll be using both legends and canon sources in today's holocron, so join us as we explore why Darth Vader hated those that were most loyal to his master. In the very beginning, Vader didn't actually think very much of the guards. His master had decided not to reveal himself as a Sith, and therefore needed guards to keep himself safe when in the public eye. That only made sense, and of course, it made more sense to ensure that the guards he surrounded himself with were the most capable warriors in the entire galaxy. They were trained to absolute perfection in the ways of hand-to-hand combat and weapons proficiency. Their reaction timing was on the level of a Force sensitive, to the point where many compared their physicality to that of the Jedi Knights. But they were nothing in the shadow of Darth Vader. His power outshined them all on almost every level. Vader would even be included in their training. He would go to the planet where all of the Royal Guard initiates practiced, and he would find out which one was best in their class and would challenge them to a duel. There, he would promptly kill the trainee in the ring. This was to prove that although they thought they were the absolute best the galaxy had to offer, they would never be good enough for the Emperor, and that they had to go beyond what they thought was possible. For the first couple of years, Vader paid them little mind besides when he had to interact with them directly for one reason or another. In the canon novel Lords of the Sith, Palpatine and Vader would crash land on the world of Ryloth, and were forced to survive in the rebel-infested jungles. The survivors included 2 Sith Lords and 2 Royal Guards. When they had permission to remove their helmets at the camp, Vader noted that one of them was a Jango Fett clone, a veteran of the Clone Wars who had risen through the ranks and managed to make it to the Guard Force. It was the highest honor a clone like him could ever achieve, and Vader didn't actually know the clone personally, as he wasn't of the 501st, but given all of his tattoos, Vader speculated that the other trooper back in the day may have been nicknamed Ink. Vader and the guards would work together to get Palpatine to a safe Imperial outpost located on Ryloth, and it's important that the guards worked together with Vader extremely well, and didn't step on each other's toes, and we believe this was for one simple reason: a common goal. That goal is obviously the protection of the Emperor. To this end, Vader would fight right alongside the Royal Guards in a few other instances in the lore that we can find, one being when Palpatine's life was being threatened by the Hindsnake cult. Once Lord Vader had finally tracked their base to an unknown moon, 2 Royal Guards accompanied him there for the slaughter. And then there was the case of the mutiny of Grand Moff Tracta. In that situation, Vader and the Guard Force personally took out waves upon waves of traitorous stormtroopers. But again, in all of these scenarios, Vader tolerated the guards for the express purpose of keeping Palpatine safe. But this would turn out to be this one subject that worked as a double-edged sword. Their intense loyalty to Sidious was a benefit only to Palpatine. The thing that the guards and Vader soon came to realize, though, is that we are not loyal to the Empire or the institution. The guards were not even loyal to the Sith as an order, but loyal exclusively to the Emperor as an individual. As a result, they answered only to him, and did not take orders from Vader without first getting express permission from Palpatine. On the contrary, they were prepared to fight against Lord Vader should it be the Emperor's wish at any command, or if it falls in line with keeping the Emperor's will. In a deleted scene from Return of the Jedi, Vader on the second Death Star approaches the turbolift to Palpatine's throne room. Flanking the door are the Imperial Guards, and in front of it is Grand Moff Jerjerrod. The Moff tells Vader that he's not allowed to enter the room, and in response to the perceived insubordination, Vader begins to force choke the Moff. At this though, the guards shift their stance and proceed to aim their pikes at Vader in hostility. Between gasping breaths, Jerjerrod informs him that it was the Emperor's wish not to be disturbed by anyone. The Dark Lord then releases the Moff and acquiesces, of course, only to the will of his master. And in response, the Royal Guards return to their neutral positioning. This is a great instance where the guards are prepared to enforce the Emperor's desire to be left alone, even against Vader, without any sort of hesitation. They most certainly would have died there, but nevertheless, they didn't cower at this show of power. This became the primary reason that Vader came to despise them. He did not like that there was a level of command within the Empire that he did not have direct access and power over. This is the same reason why he also hated the Emperor's hands. They did not take orders from him unless Palpatine expressly told them to do so. Of the Emperor's hands, Vader detested Mara Jade in particular, because Mara often used this fact as a way to blatantly undermine Vader without consequence. Although the Red Royal Guards were less ambitious than the Emperor's hands were, they were still outside of Vader's jurisdiction despite him being second only to the Emperor. As the apprentice in the Rule of Two, it was Vader's opinion that there should be nothing out of reach from him besides his own master. Sidious constantly touted that the Sith were above all. They were the rulers of the galaxy. Nothing was beyond their grasp and their will, and all would bend the knee to their power. As a Dark Lord of the Sith, Vader believed that he was not to be challenged by anyone he perceived as a lesser being, and yet, there existed a faction that did not heed him without the Emperor's express approval, and Palpatine knew this. Palpatine used it as an insult. With all of that said though, Vader was not opposed to harming or even murdering them if they failed to do their job. They existed for the sole purpose of keeping the Emperor safe and to do his bidding. If they failed in this aspect, they were less than worthless. On one occasion, Vader managed to thwart an attempt on his master's life. He had burst into Palpatine's office after learning a plot against him. Catching Palpatine by surprise, Vader force-pulled him out of his chair and threw the chair out of the window before it exploded. There had been a hidden bomb in the seat which almost successfully executed the Emperor, and for their failure in not detecting the bomb, Vader lifted the two present guards and expressed his desire to kill them slowly, but because he did not have the luxury of time, he threw them both out of the window. The rest of the royal guards rushed into the office, and upon seeing what had transpired, Vader told all of them to line up. He proceeded to scold them for their incompetence. One of the guards actually apologized and kneeled down, saying that Vader should take their head as payment. At this, all of the royal guards except for the two that kneeled down, all of those that sought penance directly from Lord Vader, accepting whatever punishment awaited them. But with that, many remained standing and refused to kneel, wordlessly expressing their protest and not accepting responsibility for allowing assassins to come so close to killing the Emperor. For their hubris, Vader relieved them both of their heads with one slash of his lightsaber. Those who bowed, he allowed to live, hoping that they had learned their lesson. Sidious approved of his guards being punished here. If Vader hadn't done so, he likely would have done so himself, and made it far more slow and horrific. Having said that, this was an extremely rare occasion in the lore. Unlike other Imperials, the Royal Guards were typically completely off limits to Vader's punishment and influence. This fueled his contempt for them, as he didn't like that not only did they not take orders from him, but they were basically untouchable. And what made Vader even more frustrated is that many of them knew this. I believe this touched a sore spot of Anakin, who remembered the time as a Jedi when the High Council ruled so many things off limits to the young Jedi. All of the knowledge he craved, all of the power that he desired, they were kept out of his reach, and he was told to suck it up. As a Dark Lord of the Sith, he was promised the galaxy and everything within it. He was told that the dark side would grant his every desire, and that nothing would be out of his grasp. The life of his wife Padme was the first instance that proved that this was a complete lie, and the limitations imposed on his body by his armor was the second. But Palpatine continues with his lie. The Royal Guards exist who are an entirely different command tier than Vader, answering only to Sidious and not to him. But to make things even worse, the Royal Guards started popping up everywhere in the galaxy. Sidious rarely went anywhere without them. They were the only beings who were allowed to fly his personalized class shuttle, or any ship that Palpatine was personally riding on. So it was almost to the point that Vader was never alone with Sidious because of their perpetual presence. It rubbed the Dark Lord the wrong way that lesser beings were clued into Sith business on the regular. In canon continuity, Palpatine makes things much worse, lending Vader his guard to be in his own home. In his castle on Mustafar, the Royal Guards stand as sentinels whenever Vader is in his bacta tank. This was when he was at his most vulnerable, and begrudgingly, he needed them there to protect him while he was without his armor. But if we had to guess, Vader knew that he was being watched by them, that Palpatine was telling him that in his most private moment, he would always be there. When Vader was at his most vulnerable, the influence of Darth Sidious would always be present. He could take him out at a moment's notice. Or at least, that's the message he was attempting to send. Vader felt watched by them, and from what we read in the comics, one of Sidious's favorite hobbies was messing with Vader. There was really no telling if or when the Royal Guards would just attack Vader on a whim. And to make matters worse, Palpatine could justify it all as a test for his apprentice. He had promised him the galaxy, And yet, within the Empire, he had elected those that were beyond Vader's power. Vader knew that he could never let his guard down for even a moment while the guards were around. But of course, he couldn't simply order them to leave him alone either, because after all, they only answered to Palpatine. The two greatest Sith Emperors, two sets of royal guards, but who comes out as the true strongest of them all? Greetings lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. While many Sith empires have existed in the past, very few compared to the power and the might of the two accomplished by Darth Vitiate and Darth Sidious respectively. They were the mightiest emperors of Sith history, but while we often talk about their individual power and their own military strength, there was one area that we have not yet covered. Every emperor must be protected by their entourage of highly trained elite guards. Sith emperors are no different, and these two share an order of red-robed warriors that cultishly follow their lord's every whim. But while we're a bit more familiar with the deadly skill of Palpatine's royal guard, how do they measure up against their historical counterparts, Vitiate's own Imperial Guard? Well, my friends, in today's holocron, we will compare these seemingly identical protectors to see who is truly the best at defending their emperor. But unlike these two Sith Lords, our own archives are without guard. This leaves them open to being viewed by those who have not yet subscribed. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more comparisons like it, force crush that subscribe button and comment down below what other factions you would like to see pitted against one another. Now, my friends, let us begin. This video will be a pretty straightforward comparison, as we'll evaluate their equipment, training, skill, and the battlefield feats of each guard faction. And because they're more well known, we'll begin by analyzing Palpatine's royal guards first. Unlike Darth Vitiate, Palpatine did not choose to be publicly known as a Sith Lord. When the Galactic Empire took over, Sidious made it a point to maintain his public persona as Emperor Palpatine. His reasoning was that it would look badly with his public image to have one order of Force sensitives just replaced by another one that would appear identical to the first. He had spent a great deal of time and effort sowing fear and malcontent between the galactic citizens and the Jedi. That fear is what helped him to legally enact the mass arrest and genocide of their people. To out himself as a Force wielder in turn would look terrible and could spell a mass uprising. To that end, it was prudent that he kept his cover to all but a select few individuals. The reason we bring this up is because this is the crux behind why he had royal guards in the first place. If Palpatine's life were ever to be threatened, he could not defend himself without showing his true power. And Lord Vader was not always near him, of course. After all, it wasn't the apprentice's job to be his 24/7 bodyguard. Vader was an enforcer, and was usually out in the galaxy doing the Emperor's will. Not to mention, Palpatine needed guards near him that were totally loyal to him. Vader's loyalty was never guaranteed, but for individuals to hold Palpatine's life within their hands, they had to be sharp, quick, and more skilled than even the finest warriors that the galaxy had seen. More skilled than many Jedi. Luckily, there was a few templates that Palpatine had to work with. Templates for him to examine. The first, of course, was the Imperial Guards Vitiate had, which is the one we're comparing them with today. But the second, and the most prominent, were the guards of Sidious's own master, Darth Plagueis the Wise. During his life, Plagueis had a thrall of mercenaries under his employment known as the Sun Guards. They were warriors from the Thrysnian system that had origins of noble fighters, the species known as the Ichani. Eventually, the Sun Guards struck off on their own, forming a religious faction that had historical animosity towards the Mandalorians. They were a fierce group that served Plagueis with fanatic loyalty until the day that he died. It was the design of their helmets which inspired the look of Palpatine's own royal guards. In fact, their helmets were literally just red-colored versions of the helmets worn by the Sun Guard. Palpatine's life had actually been saved by the Sun Guards more than once, as they were all privy to the knowledge of the Sith. And so, likely as a tribute to them, Palpatine would design his own royal guards after them. We will be making a video on the Sun Guards and Plagueis' protectors in the future. But anyway, along with these helmets, they wore flowing robes that hid vibro swords, heavy blaster pistols, and repeating blaster rifles. But their main weapon was either the stun pike or the double-sided vibro blade. Being trained in these classic weapons ensured that they would be able to do battle with any kind of enemy, whether ranged or melee. And as we'll find out, Palpatine ensured that this would include Jedi Knights. He was well aware that Jedi or other Force sensitives may come after him, and he had to be sure that his guard was well equipped to handle any type of threat. To this end, he had them trained on the arid world of Yin Chor. the original home planet of a dangerous reptilian species that once gave the Jedi a great deal of trouble. It was a harsh and a desolate place that was meant to cool the weak and to strengthen the strong. Initiates were harvested from a dozen of the Empire's top squads across their military branches. Being the best of the best was considered the bare minimum requirement for Royal Guard training. They were taught the deadly art of the Ichani warriors, a combat system which turned a person's body into a living weapon. They were then put into a pressure cooker known as the Squall. This was a platform battle arena suspended over a deep pit. Day and night the trainees were drilled against one another, sometimes even to the death. These days were long, but some days were worse. There were days when Darth Vader would visit, selecting the student who was considered to be the finest of them all. He would then challenge them to a duel, murdering them in front of their classmates. All of this was to prove that even what they considered to be their very best was not good enough for the Emperor. Out of a typical class of either 30 or 40 trainees and initiates, only one would graduate and be allowed to join Palpatine's own personal entourage. And while they saw battle only very rarely, there were no other warriors like them in the galaxy. Despite most of them not being Force sensitive, they had the reflexes of a fully trained Jedi, displaying the capability to take on multiple armed enemies at a time, and famously, able to reflect blaster fire back with their vibro swords. A single Royal Guard Kurkanos was once able to take on an entire army by himself. He did this by joining the battle against a traitorous Imperial warlord, cutting down swarms of stormtroopers while dual-wielding his double-bladed vibro sword and a blaster pistol. During the fight, he bullseyed a TIE fighter pilot through his viewport mid-fight, sending the fighter crashing into the enemy ranks. After this, all of them retreated. Kurkanos was later identified by an older man who stated that the only two kinds of a being in the galaxy with that kind of skill were the Royal Guards and the Jedi Knights. They were indoctrinated in their very training to believe that Palpatine and his order were beyond fault or question. Their undying loyalty to him made them cast aside their own safety or their livelihood, and it was purposeful that they would go throughout training alongside a personal companion, but by the end of the training, they would have to duel their companion to the death in front of Palpatine himself. Proof of loyalty. If they refused, Vader would murder them both. It was this loyalty that made Vader both respect and dislike the Royal Guard. He appreciated that they would never betray the Emperor or his empire, and that they were willing to throw their lives aside for the greater good of the Sith. But he didn't like that they only answered to Sidious, never taking his orders unless the Emperor told them to do so. If Palpatine wished for them to attack Vader for any reason, which he did order them on a couple occasions, then they would do it without question and without hesitation. They did fear Vader, because their loyalty to Palpatine overrode that fear though. This made them especially difficult and dangerous enemies, particularly when they were in large groups and coordinated. And so, my friends, this is our analysis on Palpatine's own Royal Guards. But now it is time to match them up with the lesser known, the older guards that served Emperor Vitiate's empire. What if we ventured deep into the past, a dark past? Vitiate's Royal Guard went by many names, including the Sith Honor Guard and the Dark Honor Guard, but we'll just call them by their most common name, the Imperial Guard. Though they weren't just the Emperor's personal guards, they were the protectors of the Sith Sanctum, the headquarters of the old Sith Order, and the rest of the Imperial Citadel on Dromund Kaas, as well as the Sith Academy on Korriban. They share many similarities in their training that the old Royal Guard do, specifically how they are chosen from the ranks of the Imperial military. The only difference is that the military that they're being chosen from is a lot tougher than the Stormtrooper Corps. The Sith Troopers of the Old Republic were bred in a caste system for the express purpose of combat and warfare. Their training involved team combat scenarios that involved live rounds. This toughened them up beyond what was even possible among the Stormtroopers under Sidious's empire, and this is a big deal. The Imperial Guard usually lacked any degree of Force sensitivity, since most Force sensitives were funneled directly into the ranks of the Sith, though a few managed to slip past Vitiate's screening. One Royal Guard by the name of Zarvarat Tovar was found to possess some power in the Force later in life. In Palpatine's empire, Royal Guards were found to possess a measure of Force sensitivity, but if they had a lot, they were put into the elite Shadow Guard. However, in Vitiate's empire, life didn't really change for Force-sensitive Imperial Guards. They maintained their life in service to Vitiate, but were instead trained to become Sith Lords in their own right. It really depended on their own individual proficiency, but their staffs were not for stunning. They were engineered to kill in combat. And while we don't know their full loadout, the Old Republic Encyclopedia states that they had a myriad of weaponry designed to exterminate Force users. But what about their home? Rather than there being just one world for guardsmen to be trained, Vitiate hand-selected several, ensuring that they were potent with the dark side first. This was because anytime a guardsman passed their training, he would be brought before the Emperor and mentally linked to him. Vitiate would exert his power over their minds, binding their consciousness and wills to his own. This made them fanatically loyal and incapable of betraying him even. Selecting worlds strong in the dark side allowed Vitiate to form bonds with his future guardsmen more gradually. This made the process more complete. Just like the royal guards of Sidious's empire, candidates underwent a merciless training regimen that included regularly scheduled battles to the death. Their training was designed by the veterans of Vitiate's guard. The elder guardsmen would train and teach the younger group, who became too old to be useful in live combat or as the Emperor's protectors. They would be assigned to teach the newer generation. But Vitiate included a Sith flair to the process. The new recruits would eventually kill their teachers in their final exam. What we know about their training is a bit obscure, but the final product speaks for itself. They received intense training in martial arts so that they were more than a match for both Jedi and Sith alike. It wasn't a question whether one guard was able to take down a Jedi, it was something that they did on a regular basis in their timeline. But it wasn't just Jedi that they were training to take out. The Imperial Guard had to train to take out Sith as well. Every now and then, a punk Sith Lord would question the Emperor's will, and they needed to be dealt with hastily. In the lore, we can speak to a guard by the name of Lassakar. It is known that he personally executed 6 different Jedi and over 24 Sith Lords by the end of his career. The Sith of Vitiate's empire feared his Imperial Guard so much that many decided not to fight them at all if the Emperor ordered their execution. Instead, the Sith marked for death chose to lay down their lightsaber and surrender to the killing blow of the guard's electro staff. Their regular murder of Sith Lords would even extend to the Dark Council. Even the Dark Lords of the ruling council feared the Emperor's guards, though they would never admit it. None of them had any authority or insight into the guards' activities, and so they had to move around them extremely cautiously. It may seem odd to the point of incredulous that non-Force sensitives could ever get dangerous enough to pose imminent threat to the strongest Sith of an entire ancient empire. But the truth is, there's something deeper, more sinister going on here. Vitiate shared a power bond with his guards. They got stronger whenever they were in close proximity to him, and the guards could draw upon the Force to strengthen themselves. Their reputation and ability to kill fully fledged Dark Lords of the Sith is not mere talk, but it goes back several hundred years. At one point, a few council members conspired against their emperor, and once Vitiate had the traitors dealt with, he dispatched his Imperial Guards to hunt down and eradicate every member of the Dark Council. His reasoning? He wanted to start over with a fresh new set. So far, among the few Force sensitives to make it past the Imperial Guards, the most notable is the redeemed Revan, who by that point had command over both light and dark. I think when measuring these two against one another, the winner is overwhelmingly clear. Palpatine's royal guards were tough beyond belief for their day, and it is a feat well known on its own to be considered equal to a Jedi. But Vitiate's Imperial Guards totally blow them out of the water. While the Royal Guards were speculated to at least be on par with Jedi Knights, the Imperial Guards regularly slaughtered Jedi Masters and Dark Lords of the Sith that sat upon the Dark Council. There really is no comparison here. But what do you think, my friends? Did you expect for Vitiate's Guard to be so extremely powerful? We certainly didn't. Did you anticipate that Palpatine's guard would lose in such finality? Unsurprisingly, yet again, the power of Darth Vitiate is extremely terrifying here. Throughout the lore, both in Legends and canon, there has been 4 distinct orders of crimson-wearing Imperial protectors: Vitiate's Sith Imperial Guard, Palpatine's Royal Guard, Snoke's Praetorian Guard, and the Fel Imperial Knights. And of all of them, the Imperial Guards might just be the most powerful. Emperor Palpatine has a problem with staying dead. After his death on the second Death Star, the galaxy heaved a sigh of relief, but only a mere 6 years later he would return in the form of a younger clone body, commanding a new dark empire from his throne world of Biss. It required Luke temporarily embracing the dark side, and then the combined strength of both Skywalker siblings to ultimately defeat Sidious once and for all. Or at least so they thought. Darth Sidious would return one more time through a broken down and a decrepit clone body. Sidious was vanquished for the last time when he attempted to take the infant Anakin Solo's body, only to be repelled by the Skywalkers. Guards. But there was a hidden factor to this ultimate downfall, a secret enemy that not even Palpatine himself knew of or could have predicted. The real cause behind his demise was one of his own royal guards. And not just any royal guard, but a sovereign protector, the best of the best, the ones who were the most loyal to him in all of the Empire. And trust us, this isn't clickbait either. In today's Holocron, we're going to discuss the villainous machinations of Carnor Jax, the Emperor's true murderer. Most interestingly, Carnor Jax got his start as the son of a Thyrisian Sun Guard. They were the men who came before the Royal Guard, the inspiration behind them. The Sun Guard had faithfully served Sidious's own master Darth Plagueis, before falling into his own service following Plagueis' death. Jax's father was executed by Sidious for failing to recover an ancient Sith holocron. It seemed as though Carnor Jax had his destiny laid out before him from the very beginning. Later in life, Jax would join the Stormtrooper Corps, but he proved to be so efficient that he was elevated to becoming a Shadow Trooper. These were the elite stealth units who wore black armor and served under the Black Hole, the Imperial Intelligence Director. Even there, he stood out amongst his peers, and was so selected to go through the training of a Royal Guard. One of the secrets behind his success, though, was that Jax was Force sensitive, using the Force to augment his movements in a more rudimentary way, but it was enough for him to excel to just about any kind of physical training that he undertook. He went through the same training that all the Royal Guards go through. He'd be sent to Yinchor, where he was taught the most dangerous fighting systems in the galaxy, including the lethal Ichani martial art. Although he received training in all manner of weaponry, he specialized in the double vibroblade, which is the most iconic weapon of the Royal Guards. While there, he and the other trainees tested their mettle in the Squall, a fighting arena where they often had to duel one another to severe injury or even death. In the arena, Jax regularly fought and won against another trainee by the name of Kurkanos. But of course, Jax's inherent Force sensitivity gave him an edge. As the initial number of recruits dwindled to a much smaller one, the remaining men were put into pairs in order to learn how to rely on their brothers for support. The trials and training took a drastic step up at this point, so that the pairs would be forced to rely on each other to complete the tasks that were set before them. Jax was paired with another recruit whom he never fully respected, and despite their inability to work together on the level of some of the other pairings, Jax and his partner were able to become one of the last two pairs to survive the training. The other pairing was Kurkanos and another trainee. But their final test and graduation consisted of the pairings each presenting themselves before the Emperor and being commanded to fight their brother to the death. This was the ultimate test of loyalty and a test of skill. For Carnor Jax, it wasn't a difficult task at all. He executed his training brother with ease and without hesitation, and was elevated to the position of a Royal Guard. Kurkanos did the same, and both were elevated, feeding more into their rivalry. The years would pass and Jax would serve the Emperor faithfully. Yet, he may have been the only Royal Guard who was not indoctrinated with undying loyalty. The only one. The other guards had an almost cultist worship of their master Palpatine, believing him to be their life and their breath. But Jax, this was not true for him. His ambitions and desire for more personal power overrode any brainwashing and conditioning that the Empire administered. Jax knew that he was destined for greatness, but was biding his time, learning. Apparently during this time, he also managed to keep his Force sensitivity a secret. Either that or he was unaware of his true power. But no matter the reason, Palpatine never discovered his sensitivity, and so he never joined the Shadow Guards. This of course may have saved his life in the end, as he was not one of the guards present during the Battle of Endor, and he also didn't have his mind erased as most Shadow Guards did. With the destruction of the second Death Star, Palpatine had been officially defeated. Carnor Jax had been on Coruscant, and when news of Sidious's death reached his ears, Sate Pestage became the acting Emperor. Jax's path in life would change when the former Emperor's hand, Lady Lumaya, requested a detachment of the Royal Guard. Lumaya was one of the only hands to receive actual Sith training from Lord Vader. Devastated by his death, Lumaya declared herself a Dark Lady of the Sith and desired to continue the Sith lineage. When she received Jax as a part of her requested unit, she immediately recognized his potential in the Force and scouted him for official Sith training. Carnor accepted, seeing that this was finally the avenue for greater power that he had always desired. He would receive formal Sith training as a true apprentice, though with only the knowledge that Lumaya had. She was far from a proper Sith Lord, but at least she had the training from Vader and was currently searching for more Sith holocrons for enlightenment. Together, the two of them made large plans to take over the Empire, and that began with weeding out what remained of Palpatine's influence. They journeyed on to the world of Bosthrida and systematically executed the prophets of the dark side. This was a Sith-adjacent cult devoted only to Sidious that continued to rule the Empire in his image. Lumaya then faded into the shadows, however, choosing to work in the background and to have her apprentice be the face of their operation. As a royal guard, Jax carried a significant amount of weight in the realm of Imperial politics, and under his master's direction, he infiltrated the Imperial ruling council, forming an alliance with Sarkev Quest. This was yet another one of the Emperor's hands who had integrated into the Imperial Council in order to spy on Palpatine's political enemies. He too wished to rule the Empire, and saw this as a golden opportunity. Using his influence, he backed Lord Jax as a potential figurehead for the throne, as Emperor. And so, the alliance of these dark side wielders began manipulating their way through the Imperial remnant, ascending closer to the throne. However, a massive wrench was thrown in their plan when Sidious emerged once more. Having used the ancient technique of essence transfer, Sidious had survived the Death Star and went into one of his clone bodies on Biss. Deep in the core, Palpatine revealed himself leading a brand new regime. A regime that he called the Dark Empire. He had barely any interest in the squabbling pieces of his former empire, spending the last 6 years letting them destroy themselves against the New Republic. This was all to test the strength of the New Republic before he made his own attack, and now that he was back, Sidious was unleashing his fleets, war machines, and superweapons left and right. For the first time, Sidious became a warlord. Without having to cover up his true power, the new Emperor was fleeing the dark side of the Force at his enemies with wild abandon and pure aggression. Lumaya, Quest, and Karnor Jax all decided that in order for their plans for power to succeed though, they needed to undermine and ultimately destroy Palpatine. They knew that going against him publicly would be a death sentence. Many of the Imperial remnants were flocking to his leadership, and the Dark Empire was simply too powerful to fight in the open. But Jax knew exactly how to take care of his old master. After all, he was still a royal guard. Karnor Jax returned to Palpatine's service and was elevated to a sovereign protector. This was a better position than he could have ever hoped for. He was now even closer to Sidious and was able to spy on his secrets. Not only this, but the new black armor with the red accents fit the Dark Lord persona quite well, and Jax began to believe that he was destined to become the Emperor. Meaning to secure support for Jax's plan were treated with the utmost security. Any person that disagreed with his treachery or anyone that acted as though they would reveal a plan to Sidious were immediately killed. There were a few close calls even, but due to Jax's loyal second-in-command, the traitors were dealt with. Meanwhile, the undercover Jax would discover how the Emperor had survived and how he was keeping himself alive. The clone bodies were the key, and there were dozens of them. Jax then requested an extremely large sum of credits from Quest, who would secure them by embezzlement from the Imperial ruling council. Using the funds, Jax bribed the Emperor's personal physician to sabotage the clone bodies, making them all unstable. The clone vessels were unable to handle Palpatine's incredible strength in the Force, and it was rapidly aging and deteriorating them, forcing him to search for brand new vessels or hop in between them. His final defeat came on Onderon when he attempted to seize the infant Anakin Solo's body for his own, but he was too weak to use his powers at full to defend himself against the Jedi. Due to the brave sacrifice of an Order 66 survivor, Palpatine was finally destroyed, and in the process, Karnor Jax had avenged his father. So in a poetic way, there were several people whom Palpatine wronged that had a hand in his demise. And that is how Karnor Jax, the Emperor's most trusted royal guard, ended up being the true reason behind his death. But Jax's story doesn't end here. He indeed ascended to the throne and became the new Emperor for a time. However, he had made a deadly oversight. The bribe position was captured by the New Republic, and eventually revealed his betrayal against the Emperor, including the name of the man who had bribed him. Hiding in the shadows of the interrogation room, a lone royal guard heard the confession and rushed back to Yin Chor where the remaining royal guards were in mourning. If this information were to leak, not only would the guard hunt him down, but Karnor Jax's claim to the throne would be overturned by a furious Imperial ruling council. To cover his mistake, Jax made a drastic choice and sent a legion of stormtroopers to annihilate all of the remaining royal guards. The troopers poured in the facility of Yin Chor, and although the royal guards were able to kill hundreds of them, they could not hold out against the forces that came in endless waves. Only a single royal guard survived, and that of course would be Jax's old rival, Kur Kanos. Lord Jax was infuriated, knowing that Kur alone had the elite skill and the intel to completely destroy his rule. He had already planned on crushing the New Republic, but now he had to put these plans on hold to hunt down the last of the guard. he ordered a massive bounty on Kano's head, as well as sending an elite detachment of forces dedicated to finding the guard. As the story plays out, Kanos would ally himself with the rebels and fight off Jax's empire. Kanos never intended on joining them and kept his allegiance to the memory of Palpatine and his dead brothers. However, his brainwashing would finally break down with the more time that he spent with the rebel leader, Mirith Sin. Jax would even find and torture Sin to bring Kanos to him. Ultimately though, it was Kanos who got the upper hand, as he lured the Dark Lord to the place that had birthed their rivalry, the arena, the Squall on Yin Chor. There, the two finally faced off in an epic climactic duel. Karnor Jax's force abilities gave him the advantage, and he would even play a dirty trick by having an Imperial sniper set up far away just in case he failed. However, the showdown was spoiled when the rebel forces arrived. Mirith had done so both to help Kanos and to bring Jax to justice. Kanos was able to triumph over his rival, but problems arose when Sin wanted to arrest Jax and have him face a New Republic trial. This conflicted with Kanos' oath to kill him, and so in a brutal and a controversial decision to honor Sidious and his fallen brothers, Kanos executed Karnor Jax. As his vibroblade pierced the chest of the Dark Lord Karnor Jax, Kanos' final words to him were this: "Thus die all traitors." The story of Karnor Jax and Kanos is told in the Crimson Empire comics, and personally, I highly recommend them. Crimson Empire 1 is only 5 issues and definitely worth a read. It's a very interesting peek into a galaxy that sort of finds itself in ruins following the Galactic Civil War, from the perspective of a royal guard. The New Republic is still reeling from the Dark Empire crisis, and we get a nice tight story told between two rivals. Along with this is a never-before-seen insight into the Royal Guards themselves. What happened to Palpatine's Royal Guards after his final death? Greetings again, and welcome back to the archives. The Imperial Guard were stated to be the most elite fighting force that the Empire had to offer. Despite being largely unable to touch the Force, the guards were able to contend on the level of trained Force sensitives. Their insane level of physical ability and loyalty was what made them the perfect guard to the Emperor, who didn't want to reveal his identity as a Dark Lord even in the face of danger. After Palpatine died on the second Death Star, however, many of the Royal Guards chose to end their own career on the bladed tip of their spears. But for those that stuck around and were aware of Palpatine's return, they got transported to the world of Biss, where they would continue their service. But of course, even that ended too, with all of Sidious's cloned bodies being destroyed, which left behind one sole survivor of this deadly squad of protectors. Today's story, we will be exploring the 3-part Crimson Empire comic. We will be prioritizing the path of the Royal Guard himself without deviating as best as possible. Though I highly recommend that you check out Crimson Empire, as it is an excellent read-through and very well drawn, as well as has fascinating galactic intrigue. And if you enjoy us doing full comic plot summaries, then be sure to let us know what other stories you want to see explored down below. Now, this story is the story of Kanos, the very last of the Royal Guard. Kanos got his start the way that all Royal Guards would, in the Elite Guard Academy on the planet of Yachor. It was harsh and a desolate place meant to cull the weak and to strengthen the strong. Yin Chor had once been inhabited by a sort of reptilian species that had been all but wiped out or driven off of the planet by the Empire to create a more lonely. This was intentional to create an even darker environment. Initiates were harvested from dozens of the Empire's top squads across the military branches, and they were deemed the best of the best. But even so, their training had not yet begun. They were taught the deadly art of the Ichani warriors, a combat system which turned a person's body into a living weapon. They were then put into a pressure cooker known as the Squall, which was a platform battle arena which hung over a deep pit. Day and night, the trainees were drilled against one another. It was here where Kanos and his fellow trainee, Karnor Jax, constantly sparred against one another. Jax was one of the top performers in his group, because unbeknownst to him, he was actually Force sensitive. But the day would soon come when both Jax and Kanos would remember for the rest of their lives. The day that the Emperor and Lord Vader visited Yin Chor. Sidious stepped out to meet his soon-to-be guards, to build rapport with them, a deep connection. In an odd moment, we get to see the Emperor show his kind and fatherly side, as he thanks the trainees for giving up so much of their lives in order to serve him, their lives themselves, even going as far as to say that they honor him with their sacrifice. This, of course, is a brilliant mind play by the Emperor. By speaking the words of graciousness and honor, it reinforces their brainwashing, their indoctrination to ensure that each and every guard is fanatically loyal to Palpatine alone. But then, Almost in direct contrast to how he spoke so kindly to the guards, he calls out Lord Vader for a demonstration. Vader immediately demands to know who their best pupil is. One of the trainees steps forth by the name of Bur Danid. Vader takes the man, lifts him out of the squall, and the two of them arm themselves with the Royal Guard's double vibroblades. Vader instructs the trainee to attack him, to hold nothing back. Kanos mentions that Danid's attacks and defenses were flawless. He had the perfect technique. He had been the best of the Royal Guard. But Vader toyed with him as if he were a child with a toy, made a joke of their champion in front of all of the initiates. In one quick movement, Vader severed the boy's arm and kicked him off of the platform to his death. Afterwards, he turned to the traumatized troopers, the trainees, and told them that if he was the best of them, that they were not fit to serve the Emperor, not even fit to die for him. This was the environment that Kanos and Jax and the rest of the guards were born into, trained into, abandoning their past identity and giving it solely to the Emperor. But it would make them inhumanly powerful as well. The Royal Guards were trained in pairs so that they could grow from one another's strengths, to learn from one another's weaknesses, becoming brothers in the process. Kano's partner was named Lemet Tak, and only those two, along with Jax and his partner, would survive the entire Royal Guard training process. But at the very end, Palpatine ordered each pair to be brought individually before him within his throne room, where he then revealed why he wanted them trained in pairs. When Kanos and Tak entered, he said that there was only one spot for a Royal Guard available in his force, and they would need to know which of the two were worthy to fill that void. They would now need to prove their loyalty, to kill one another. A fight to the death. Only one student would survive, and at his command, their training took over their bodies, and the brothers fought one another to the death. Kanos was the victor, stabbing his best friend in the stomach with his vibroblade, and emptying his guts. And even though he was accepted into the service of Palpatine, Vader wanted to prove one final point. He commanded Kanos to fight him next, and within a matter of seconds, Vader delivered a glancing blow which left a large lightsaber scar across Kanos' face. This was just to prove that no matter how skilled that he thought he was, he would always be inferior to the dark side. But now we venture to the year 11 ABY. Palpatine is dead, and what remains of the Empire is in total chaos. A temporary ruling council of Moffs has been established, as well as admirals that has been formed to maintain order, but they are too splintered in their power. Each member has conflicting ambitions. The Empire is on the brink of collapse, but one man has risen up to take control of the Imperial remnant, Karnor Jax, who by this point in time had become one of the Sovereign Protectors. The Sovereign Protectors were essentially the absolute best of what even the Royal Guard could offer. They had ascended to this position through great bloodshed and victory in war. But not only is Jax the best of the Old Guard, but he has finally received some training in the Force by this point, from none other than the Sith Lumaya. Jax has now a new ambition, deciding that he should be the one on the throne to create a new empire. In fact, he actually paid off Palpatine's physician to intentionally create defective clone bodies of the Emperor. This is why they aged so rapidly when Sidious transferred his body and his spirit into them, leading to his ultimate downfall. Jax had been the nail in the coffin, the guard that betrayed his Emperor. The Royal Guards learned of this treachery, however, and they all swore an oath to destroy Jax for his crime. However, Jax was 2 steps ahead of them. He ordered a ruthless attack on the Royal Guards and the base on Yinchor, and destroyed the Academy and all of the guards in totality. Waves upon waves of stormtroopers assailed the Royal Guards, and even though they fought hard, not even they could stand up to the endless onslaught of the stormtroopers, tsunamis of white faces. Finally, the final 2 Royal Guards would ensure that their oath did not die with them. One of them stayed behind to sacrifice himself, while the other escaped. The one who managed to leave was Kur Kanos, the last of the Royal Guard. Using blackmail, Jax put himself in a special position which allowed him to control the ruling council. But his ambition did not stop here. Jax had it on his mind that he is to replace the Emperor as the new Dark Lord of the Sith. But no one else knew of this true plot, except for one man, the last of the Royal Guards that survived, Kur Kanos, his former classmate. Kanos hid out on the fringes of space, gathering his resources, dodging Imperial forces. He had become an exile to the Empire that he had once loved, and served with his entire being, but he was no longer loyal to them, only to the memory of the master that he served. Jax wanted nothing else but to find this last survivor, as he is the one person that presents the greatest threat to his plan, simply because he knows about what Jax did to the Emperor's bodies. If that were to ever reveal itself, Jax's bid for the throne would utterly crumble. Kainos, now on the run, took no chances when dealing with the Empire, and had absolutely no qualms about slaughtering anyone that stood in his way. When a stormtrooper garrison tried to find him at his home, they were met with a trap as the entire house exploded. It was a trap that Kainos had left behind. Finding one of the Emperor's elite would definitely prove to be a tricky process. Meanwhile, on the neighboring world of Theta, he attempted to hide out in a bar, only for a group of Imperial officers and stormtroopers to start a problem with him. And this is where we get to see how he was able to survive for so long. And as an officer pulls out his blaster on Kainos, the guard unveils his double-bladed vibro sword. He kills the officer then and there. 3 other officers stand in his way though, but he stabs one of them and pins his sword, murdering the other 2 officers before they can ever pull the trigger on their own blasters. A garrison of stormtroopers was next, responding to what they heard in the back, and after killing 2 more Imperials, Kainos deflects a blaster bolt from one of the troopers. He single-handedly ends the party with another spin of his sword, which delivered 2 simultaneous cuts so accurate that they perfectly slit the throats of 2 stormtroopers. This was the power of a royal guard. They displayed Jedi-like skill and accuracy with death. By this point in the galaxy, it was said that only the royal guards were anywhere close to the skill of a Jedi Knight. But not wanting to be discovered, Kainos escaped the bar with the help of a sympathetic stranger, who turned out to be an agent of the New Republic. Kainos is brought up to meet with the leader of the rebel cell, by the name of Murith Sin, who determines that since they have the same enemies, that they must be allies. A man of Kainos' skill is very useful to the New Republic, as they attempt to take out the last remnants of the Empire. Kainos begrudgingly allies with them, simply because it is the most convenient way to destroy Jax and to get revenge on the traitors to the Empire. However, Kainos has absolutely no interest in remaining allies with the New Republic, or supporting any rebel movements. After all, he is an Imperial at heart. His only love was his Emperor, but now he is gone, so all he has left is revenge. Kainos attempts to keep his status as a royal guard hidden from his new friends, however, until the secret rebel base is attacked by the Empire. The Empire has placed a manhunt on Kainos after the bar incident, and the sympathetic stranger who led Kainos to the world is now also revealed as a double agent and a traitor for the Empire. By this point, the location of Kainos was being reported to the ears of Lord Jax. With the rebel base under siege, Kainos at last dons his crimson armor and makes his appearance known on the battlefield in the light of day. A red royal guard, the last of them. It was now time for the Emperor's elite guard to fight on behalf of the rebellion against what he saw as a false emperor and empire. The Crimson Warrior descends upon the battlefield like a blood-soaked angel of death, wreaking havoc in the Imperial front line. One of the rebel squads has been completely outflanked and would have been wiped out entirely had Kainos not arrived just in time to completely turn the tide of battle. Wielding his vibro sword in his left hand and his blaster in his right, he was truly a one-man army, cutting his way through waves of stormtroopers, cutting cleanly through their craniums and stabbing through their armor like it was made of butter. Right when a TIE interceptor was about to make a pass on the rebel ground forces, Kainos whirled around and aimed his blaster pistol straight into the cockpit of the ship. With a single bolt, he bullseyed the pilot and sent the interceptor crashing right into the Imperial forces below. It was after this when the enemy ordered a full-fledged retreat, terrified of the Emperor's chosen, one who had inflicted such warfare and blood, killed more than any other rebel soldier, maybe even more than all of them combined. And after word reached Karnor Jax, he knew that he had to go personally. After receiving a full report on the situation, he knew it was time to kill the last of his brothers. Meanwhile, Kainos is insisting on leaving the New Republic, striking off on his own, and despite their proposal for him to join the rebellion and the New Republic, he still insisted that they could only ever be enemies, that his allegiance now lie only with the dead. As a thank you though, the rebels help him off of the world in a captured TIE bomber. In order to keep the Imperials off of his tail, Sin actually manages to dress as Kainos, pretending to be him returning to the ship that he arrived to the world in. Immediately, she is captured by Jax and his Imperials who had been waiting for him. Jax proceeds to have the woman tortured and interrogated on where he ran off to. Finally, he is able to break her will, only once Jax threatens to orbitally bombard the world and the rebel base. It is only then that the rebel divulges that they helped Kanos get off of the world, and that he was going back to Yin Chor. Jax discerns through the Force that she is telling the truth, and he knows that his old classmate has gone to the world to end where it all began. But it wouldn't be long after Lord Jax left the world that Rogue Squadron and the New Republic arrived to annihilate the Imperial occupation, putting an end to part of the False Empire at least. The self-proclaimed Dark Lord, however, arrived on Yin Chor to face down his old rival. Kanos had one surprise left though, and ordered that his TIE bomber remain in orbit, wanting the Empire to find it. As soon as Jax's Star Destroyer arrived, they pulled the bomber in with their tractor beam. However, Jax knew that his old friend thought like a warrior, and he immediately departed from the Star Destroyer on his personal shuttle. As soon as he did this, it was discovered that the TIE was a decoy, and it detonated a bomb within, which completely destroyed the Star Destroyer. Jax remains completely undeterred, however, despite having his ship destroyed by a single man, and he has his shuttle land on Yin Chor with a squad of shadow troopers at his back. He sends them into the ruins of the Royal Guard Academy to find Kanos. However, he didn't actually expect them to survive. He simply needed them to stall while he would set his own trap. Within the ruined academy, the shadow troopers get taken out one by one. Despite being clad in bright red and fighting black armored stormtroopers, Kanos is the one jumping from the shadows, slaughtering them with their own weapons. Finally, he makes his way out of the ruins into the old arena, back to the Squall where they had all been born. At last, the traitor arrives as Jack prepares his vibroblade. This was a place of important history to both men. Countless times they had squared off in the Squall, and many times Jax had won. In fact, Kanos had never won. The two met in the center of the arena with a flurry of blades. Each strike was met with cold steel, as neither one landed a hit. Jax insisted that soon he was going to become as powerful as Lord Vader, or even as Emperor Palpatine had been. The two continued to duel as the Dark Lord declared that he will rule the empire of Palpatine's throne to shape the galaxy in his image as a Sith. He managed to land a swift kick on Kanos and nearly runs him through. But the guard in red kicks the guard in black, nearly knocks him off the side into the pit. However, he doesn't take the opportunity to kill him there. He doesn't want Jax to fall to his death. Kanos wants to run him through with his blade, to know that he is gone. And so he kicks Jax's sword back over to him, commands him to pick it up. The fallen Sovereign Protector mentions that doing so was a mistake, and he begins to flex his abilities in the Force. Using the Force, he hurls a rock at the back of Kanos' head in a surprise maneuver. At this time though, the New Republic had made their way to Yin Chor, as the rebel had not forgiven herself for giving up the location of the final Crimson Guard, and had gone to help him destroy Jax's empire. The New Republic arrived just in time to see the ruins, and the two royal guards locked in mortal combat. It was then when they discovered the trap that Jax had laid for Kanos. He had ordered his personal officer to take high ground with a sniper, a dirty, an underhanded tactic in case Kanos somehow gained the upper hand. In the arena, Jax begins to offer his old friend a position. He reasons that Palpatine is dead, and so is the old Empire. There are no two men like them in the galaxy left, he says. They could rule it together. Kanos, however, believes in his honor. He states that his place on the council would be beside thieves and murderers. The Emperor had basically been killed by Jax's own hand, had been all of their brothers. Evenly matched, the two of them brawl ruthlessly. It becomes clear now that Jax's training in the Force never reached beyond the initiate level, and it is not proving to be the massive advantage that he had hoped for. Nevertheless, he does strike Kanos in the side with his blade, but fueled by rage, the Red Guard kicked his enemy down, hurled his vibro sword like a javelin. Filled with rage, Kanos delivers his final blow, stabbing deep into Jax's shoulder. It's at this point that the Dark Lord is about to order his sniper kill Kanos. Unfortunately for them, however, the sniper had already been disposed of by the rebels. As the New Republic arrives, it is Mirith that begs, telling Kanos that they can take Jackson alive. For with all he knew about the Imperial Remnant, he could end the war in a matter of months if they used him properly. Leveraging the fact that they would take him without harm, Jax summons one of the rebels' blasters to his hand and attempts to shoot Kanos in the head. But that is when the so-called Dark Lord gets a reality check. Kanos slaps the blaster out of his hand with the end of a vibroblade, and then stabs him with the other end. As he sinks to his knees, The last words of Jax were utter confusion, saying, "But your friends want me alive." And Kainos informs him that they are not his friends. Kainos announces Jax's execution for his crimes and stabs him yet again, but is interrupted by the New Republic as the rebel steps in front of Kainos' blade. But the movement is too decisive. In a moment of horror, Kainos stabs the rebel trooper with his vibroblade, and they are murdered immediately. Mirith is mortified at what Kainos has done, and asks why he would do such a thing after they helped him. And now we are reminded of who Kainos is. He is no hero. He is loyal to the Emperor alone, loyal to a path of vengeance, not to the rebels, not to the New Republic. He apologizes coldly, but he states that he had never asked for their help, but that her friend has died for a warrior's cause. By now, Jax too was dead due to his injuries, as Kainos takes the traitor's helmet and throws it deep into the Squall's pit, being unworthy of wearing it, even in death. Kainos then leaves to continue his path of vengeance on the remaining members of the Imperial Council, and the story ends with Mirith Sin declaring that Kainos is a condemned man, a man who will die by her hand, one way or another. And thus would end the first run of the comic. Time would pass, and the state of the Imperial remnants was growing ever worse. With the death of Karnor Jax, the ruling Imperial Council was left without a figurehead whatsoever. This caused all of the council members to start vying for their own positions of power. They were all now more nervous than ever about Kainos. They were aware of his desire and his promise that he would murder them all. And now, they no longer had the protection of Lord Jax, the only man who they believed could destroy the last of the Red Royal Guard. All of this was compounded by the fact that yet another head of their council had been murdered in a mysterious bombing. The members of the council now understood that the head was going to always have a target painted on their back, and they were each dropping dead by the day. The sudden power vacuum left the overturning of the Empire, as the galaxy's most superpower at the time now looked more like a criminal organization like the Black Sun, desperate and dangerous. Not to mention the Black Sun, seeing the Imperials weakened, were now vying for more control of the galaxy themselves. But they each had one thing in common. They were both trying to evade the New Republic. The galaxy of this era is much like the Wild West, as the New Republic is scrambling to consolidate new order and new power. Elsewhere in the galaxy around this time, Leia and Mon Mothma would be working together to restore the rule of law, when Luke Skywalker began searching for potential Jedi to fill in his academy. This is the era in which the second chapter of our story begins. As for Kainos though, his hunt would eventually lead him to the planet of Barra Mora. After scouting the area, Kainos found that the planet was ruled by a man by the name of Boss Banjir, the nephew of Admiral Lon Banjir, a member of the Imperial Interim Ruling Council. Banjir had several bounty hunters under his employment as well, and had hoped to capture Kainos, hoping to please his uncle. With the death of Jax, the ruling council was spurred to offer an even greater bounty for Kainos' head. With a fortune on his head, Kainos needed an ally, and quickly, and he realized the best way to hide was to take up the guise of a bounty hunter himself. And so Kainos purchased a unique set of armor, deleted his fingerprints from every database that he could find, and renamed himself Kennex Kill, an anagram of his own name in the secret language of the Royal Guard. As Kennex Kill, he infiltrated the ranks of Banjir and sufficiently impressed him with his skills in combat. While employed by Banjir as a bounty hunter, he gained his trust and learned all that he could. He pretended to know how he could find Kainos himself, and thus he was put in charge of a hunt for his own head. He then led the majority of the hunters on a wild goose chase, far away from their camp and resources. After bringing the men far away, Kainos revealed who he truly was, and effortlessly murdered all of the hunters, effectively crippling the hunting operation in the entire sector. Because Banjir was a member of the Admiral Banjir family, however, Kainos saw fit to destroy his base single-handedly, and to execute him with his own hand. After doing this, Kainos approached Grappa the Hutt for work, but Kainos was more interested in his connections, his connection to the Black Sun. Kainos knew that they were growing stronger every single day, and he needed to lay low, gain money for himself so that he could actually move around the galaxy and accomplish his assassinations. But hot on his trail was Mirith Sin, the rebel. She had now devoted herself to a vow to kill Kainos at any cost. She had also found work with Grappa the Hutt, wanting to use his resources to help find the man who she had sworn revenge on. Of course, she was currently none the wiser that Kainos was right under her nose, still hiding as Kennec's kill. But while she was searching for Kainos, her real mission, the real reason she came to Grappa, was confirmed, as it was revealed that the New Republic had grown suspicious that Grappa had been attacking their vessels, pillaging their ships. Meanwhile, the ruling Imperial Council was in a state of panic, especially after another high-ranking member was killed in a bombing. They were dropping like flies every single day, but their disarray increased with yet another one of their members being killed. Admiral Lon Bangir's corpse was found in a villa alongside a bloody knife, and by examining the evidence, the Imperial Council discovered that both the knife and the bomb were carried out by the symbol of the Royal Guard, particularly the insignia designated to Kur Kainos. They came to believe that Kainos had intentionally made a statement to them that he was coming for all of their heads, and in response, the new leader of the Imperial Council, a man by the name of Xandel Kervis, issued the largest manhunt of Kainos in the entire galaxy, one of the largest bounties that the galaxy had ever seen, Jedi, Sith, or otherwise, with a bounty that would keep generations wealthy. Kainos could not go 2 steps on any populated planet. All of their fleet resources was dedicated to finding this one Red Royal Guard. However, little did any of them know that events in the council were being puppeteered by a mysterious shadow figure in the background. Their new leader, Karavis, answered to a strange man known only as Nom Anor, a black armored and a robed figure with a hood drawn over his face at all times to conceal his identity. Nom Anor was secretly a vanguard for the still distant Yuzhong Vong, those who were currently scouting and attempting to undermine the power structure of the galaxy, ready it for invasion. Despite all evidence pointing to Kainos being the killer, he was nowhere near the Imperial world of Ord Cantrell when the murder took place. He had actually been on the bounty mission for Grappa at the time of the murders, and Nom Anor was in fact the real murderer. He had slipped the Empire's defenses, assassinated both of the council members, but had framed Kainos. But things were only going to get worse. The Shadow Master also had Grappa the Hutt under his thumb, and he had been devising a sinister plot. Under Nom Anor's orders, Grappa the Hutt had been cloning all of the members of the Imperial Ruling Council, and they had already captured someone by the name of Frina Diasta, one of the council members, and replaced her with a clone successfully without the other members realizing it. It wasn't too long before Kainos began to find out about Nom Anor though, after Grappa hastened to answer a call from him. It would be here where Mirith would discover the real Fina, deep within one of Grappa's prisons. However, Sin's true purpose as a spy in Grappa's service had been discovered, and Grappa had ordered her to be delivered over to the strange Xanabar aliens, those who practiced death rituals upon all of the victims that Grappa the Hutt gave to them so graciously. Kainos would also have to leave very soon, as word got out that the Empire was looking for him, and it was revealed that they were on their way, now knowing the name of his bounty hunting alias. But before he left, after receiving word that Sin was to be murdered in the death ceremony, the Royal Guard immediately without question went to rescue her. After saving her from the death cult and several other dangers on their homeworld, Mirith was forced to call off her vow of death against Kainos, considering that he had now saved her life several times over, and now they would be calling it even. That night, the two had a heart-to-heart talk, where Mirith told Kainos about how her husband was a farmer and had been murdered by the Empire. She showed him a recording of Vader slaying innocents, declaring that the Emperor was unconcerned if their people starved, so long as they were always obedient. With the evidence shoved right into his face, Kainos was forced to reflect on the character of the man that he had loved, the man that he had been indoctrinated to serve. For the first time in many years, he began to think for himself, began to break away from programming. He became a man, and he broke from the training. The next morning, however, a raiding party attempted to recapture the humans that escaped from their death cult. But just as all hope seemed lost, one that was loyal to Kainos, a friend of his, arrived. However, Kainos would sacrifice himself to ensure the survival of his friends. He would end up catching a stray blaster bolt and being captured by the Xanabar. But luckily for him, even the barbaric Xanabar had heard of the massive bounty on the Imperial Guard's head, and decided that they were to turn him in for their grand reward. The Xanabar brought Kainos back to Grappa the Hutt, and he would remain in a cell as the Hutt negotiated with the Imperial remnant. Shortly after, however, a Republic task force led by Mirith Sin infiltrated Grappa's headquarters and rescued the Red Guard from his incarceration. The New Republic group also liberated Frina Diasta and brought her back with them to New Republic space, now holding a member of the Imperial Ruling Council. Speaking of the Ruling Council, back on the world of Ord Cantrell, Caravis had decided to seize even more power as the head of the council, disbanding the council altogether, setting himself up as the new emperor. This was against the wishes of the Yuzhong Vong Vanguard, however, but Caravis was tired of taking orders and decided that he was taking what was rightfully his as a true Imperial. He murdered all of the non-human members of the council and imprisoned the others against the advice of his admirals. Fina, however, who had originally been placed on the council in place of her sick father, Baron Diasta, was none the wiser that she had been replaced with a clone, and when he got word that his daughter had been imprisoned by a man declaring himself as the new emperor, he seceded from the Empire completely and ordered a full attack on Ord Cantrell and what remained of the council. He ended up getting the clone of his daughter right back when Mirith and Kainos arrived to deliver him his real daughter. That was when Mirith diverged the full plot to replace all of the members of the ruling council with clones, puppet figures for the Black Sun. Confronting them, Kainos releases his vibroblade and ordered that the clone should die for her crimes against the Emperor and the Empire that he left behind. However, he was stopped from killing her by Baron Diasta and Mirith, who explained that the clone was under the control of the Black Sun Syndicate, that the clone was forced to comply against her own wishes. Mirith explained that now the entire council had either been killed or was imprisoned by the new false Emperor Caravis. This meant that he was now Kainos' true target. The Royal Guard hesitantly accepted this, however, deciding that it might just be enough to take revenge on a false emperor. Just before the attack, the Yuzhong Vong enforcer would make a final appearance to Caravis, letting him know that the people that he represents had chosen a different path, a path which no longer included the fake emperor. Caravis panics as he hears this, but Nom Anor vanishes before his eyes. The Vong have abandoned him. But right before he disappears completely, he hears the words that he should enjoy his meeting with the last of the Royal Guard. Caravis panics as he hears this, and just then, Kainos, Mirith Sin, and Baron Diasta all walk directly into the throne room. Caravis orders his guards to kill them, and a firefight breaks out. The false emperor attempts to escape, but is followed by the Crimson Shadow. No amount of pleading or bargaining was able to save the emperor's life, as Kainos backhanded him to the ground and then speared him through with his vibroblade. Once all the fighting was done, Mirith Sin and Kainos shared a brief kiss and a goodbye. He knew her heart still belonged to the New Republic, and his heart, his allegiance, to the Emperor. And so he flew off into the stars, plans of completing his revenge by taking down Leia Organa and murdering the man calling himself Luke Skywalker, the killers of the Emperor. And thus, the second chapter comes to a close. Our story picks up again 2 years later. The New Republic's power is growing unabated, and galactic peace is finally beginning to settle in. Mirith Sin has become the chief of security for Leia's family. However, she fears that soon that Kainos will be coming for the Skywalkers. Kainos himself had been laying low for the last few years, getting the heat off of his back, earning some cash as a bounty hunter. The Empire has shattered into a billion pieces. However, he is eventually found and captured by none other than Boba Fett. Boba, who successfully set a trap for him in his own apartment. Kainos made short work of all of the thugs that were waiting for him, but Boba entered the room shortly thereafter and surrounded him with more bounty hunters. Taking Kainos into custody, Boba Fett delivered him to a mysterious stronghold world. Waiting for Kainos there was an Imperial faction calling itself the true heart of the Restored Empire. Kainos was shocked to learn that the Restored Empire didn't want to kill him as the previous Empire's factions had. Instead, they believed the tales of his loyalty and bravery as legend, as a man calling himself General Vota explained to him that they honor him as the last member of the Royal Guard, as they too had remained loyal to the memory of Palpatine. However, despite claiming to honor him, they seemed distrustful of him, and they didn't let him walk around their base without an escort. The Restored Empire is led by a now eye-patched individual by the name of Supreme Commander Enix Devian. the Supreme Commander held a banquet in Kanos' favor, attempting to sway him to their cause. This is all going way too easy for Kanos, and Kanos lets him know that he is a dishonorable thug, one of Palpatine's hitmen. Kanos outright says that he does not trust the new Emperor, and he further disapproves of Deviant after watching the way that he treats his officers. He allowed the higher-ups to bully them, call them idiots for minor offenses. Not only this, but the false Emperor has decided to demonstrate his combative training to Kanos, murdering one of his best men in combat right there at the banquet, simply to gain the favor of the Red Guard. But the Supreme Commander is not done trying to win him over. He says that they were never loyal to the ruling council, or the false Emperor Caravis. He explains that they had secretly been building an armada of ships from all of the broken down ones that had been sent to this secret world during the Empire's lifetime. They planned on sending an attack on the New Republic with their secret weapon, a weapon they called the Xynthium, a volatile metal. One small chunk of this metal could destroy an entire city, and the Empire's plan was to invade Coruscant and destroy the government building, breaking apart the New Republic at its head. He desired for the last of the Royal Guard to join them, to lead the front lines of a living symbol of their loyalty to Palpatine. However, Kanos refused. He stated that even though he did serve the Emperor, that he now also knew the Supreme Commander Enix. He knew him as a brutal thug, one who enjoyed bringing misery to others. He stated that he wouldn't think of joining any faction that was involved with him. He had no righteousness, no honor in any way. Enix would then have a whole squad of stormtroopers who had been waiting behind the meeting jump out and take Kanos into custody. But the Supreme Commander would only moments later discover that the Royal Guard had pickpocketed his blaster right after leaving the room. And after Kanos had killed all of the stormtroopers, he rewired the blaster pistol, using it to explode a wall into the hangar bay. Now claiming several more blasters, he shot his way into the loading dock and escaped using one of the shuttles. However, the Supreme Commander had predicted that he would take this exact course of action and had rigged the shuttles with the dangerous metal, knowing that Kanos would take it back to Coruscant in order to warn the New Republic. As the Red Guard landed, Kanos was arrested by the New Republic and put into a cell for questioning. All they knew is that he had been sent there to murder the Skywalkers. Mirith visited him within his cell in order to catch up. It was here when Kanos explained that he did not intend on murdering the Skywalkers any longer. After visiting the restored Empire, he saw the blind devotion and what it could do to a man. He recalled the cruel way that Enix acted towards the men under his command, and Kanos accepted that the Emperor that he had served, the Empire that he had fought for, could never be regained. He revealed that he was here to save the New Republic. Unfortunately, he was none the wiser that the dangerous metal was aboard the ship. After the meeting with Kanos, the Skywalkers decided to ultimately trust him, with Luke sensing no treachery, no evil within his heart. Still oblivious to the metal embedded inside of the shuttle though, Kanos agreed to assist the New Republic. Shortly after this, technicians who inspected the ship reported traces of radiation emitting from the shuttle. Realizing that it was set to detonate, Luke immediately assumed that Kanos had laid a trap. He had been told that the Red Royal Guard was dangerous. The Jedi quickly entered the shuttle, flew it deep into orbit, and right before the ship exploded, Luke took the escape pod and managed to get off right in time. Naturally, the blame for the attack fell directly upon Kanos, but by this point, he was already accompanying Mirith Sin to a diplomatic meeting, hoping to discuss a ceasefire between the Republic and what remained of a small Imperial remnant. During the peace summit, the negotiations were interrupted by Enix Deviant stormtroopers, who attempted to murder everyone present in a surprise attack. Mirith and Kanos managed to grab blasters to take care of the attackers, but in the chaos of the firefight, Fina Diasta was shot and killed. The representative of the Imperials, after eliminating all of the troopers, it was Kanos who offered to be the one to tell Baron Diasta that his daughter had been murdered. He had helped them a few years before. The Baron ultimately understood, as he now realized the extent of Deviant's plot, and he offered an alliance with Kanos to launch an attack on the Supreme Commander's location. The Empire was about to fight the Empire, as the Remnant fought against the Restored in an all-out war. Mirith, Kanos, Baron Diasta, and his stormtroopers invaded one of Ennix's ships, fought through their waves of opposing stormtroopers. With everyone's uniforms looking similar, it was nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. Supreme Commander Ennix attempted to flee in the shuttle once he realized the war was lost, only to be stopped by Kanos. The Royal Guard had one more target. The two square off with their respective bladed weapons, as it was here that Ennix revealed that he was trained by someone special, by Lord Vader. His missing eye was a reminder from Vader about the price of failure. Ennix was far more powerful than Kanos had realized, and he had been thirsting to test his skills against one of Palpatine's finest. As the two entered a fierce battle, Ennix proved to be one of the greatest combatants that Kanos had ever faced. Maybe only Jax had been better. There was no trick that Kanos could pull that the Deviant did not know of. He had been taught as Vader's pupil, and although the Royal Guard was able to knock him down, Ennix managed to cut his vibroblade in half and stabbed Kanos right through the shoulder, right where he had stabbed Jax. It looked as though this would be Kanos' end, but with the last half of his sword, he sliced the blade of Ennix's weapon, which was still lodged in his shoulder, and in one swift movement, he stabbed downwards, driving his vibroblade vertically through Ennix's shoulder and down directly into his heart. He would die there on that ship, having forgotten Vader's most important lesson: never stop fighting until your opponent is dead. Mirith would find Kanos, managing to drag him to a shuttle as he bled out from his wounds, eventually dying a peaceful death. Much later, she would testify before the New Republic that Kirk Kanos had in fact died. He was killed in the battle with the restored Empire. In reality though, Kanos had given up his identity as the Royal Guard. He had survived secretly, giving his robes and helmet to Baron Diasta. The Baron had given sanctuary to him while he recovered from his injuries, and had also given him resources to leave, to begin a new life. From that point forward, Kirk Kanos officially ended his career. He renounced the Empire that he had once loved, and accepted that it was gone forever. And that is the official end of the last surviving member of Palpatine's Royal Guard. Kirk Kanos had an excellent run in the lore, and is a very interesting and a complex character. He began as a man who only served out of duty to the galaxy, which rejected everything about his former master. But after someone who finally fulfilled their revenge, he would change. He became his own man, retained his own identity, began to think freely. Along the way, he displayed why Palpatine's Royal Guards were some of the most terrifying warriors that the galaxy has ever seen, however, as there is basically no one even remotely close to Kanos' level of skill. I absolutely adore getting to see what the Royal Guards really have to offer when they aren't simply put on watch duty. I sincerely wish we got to see more of Lord Jax, as he was such an imposing and a powerful villain in the lore, and Jax was a great villain in the post-Palpatine era in Star Wars, and what the galaxy and landscape looks like. An Imperial Guard vying for power makes a lot of sense. I believe having one of Palpatine's Force-sensitive Royal Guards take over after his death is an excellent primary way to take a new enemy, and he would have been a great villain for an NJO order. But tell us, what do you think of Crimson Empire in the comics, and for Kirk Kanos as a man and a character? Do you want us to do more of these full comic breakdowns? And let us know in the comments down below. But finally, who is your favorite of the Red Royal Guard? And what are your thoughts on Kirk Kanos? As always, long live the Emperor, and may the Force be with you.